Good afternoon. Welcome to this first Beyond Humanism Forum. This is the first of hopefully a whole series of events which we have brought out because this year we had to postpone the Beyond Humanism conference due to the COVID-19 crisis. And therefore we have considered that we needed to provide some online forum focusing in this time precisely on the pandemic, given the many rich outlines and perspectives that post-humanistic discourses, post-trans-metahumanistic discourses could provide around this topic. So this is the main reason for our being here. We would like to share with you a number of perspectives and also keeping in mind the future physical events that we will hopefully be doing, and of which Evie will and Stefan will speak to you very soon. So I will pass soon the word to Stefan, Lorenz, Sorgner, and Evie Sampanikou, co-organizers of this event. And I will later on come back also to tell you a bit more about it. So please, Stefan.
Yeah, many thanks, Jaime. Yeah, it's so weird to be in front of the camera. Now, after all these years, we've been doing the Beyond Humanism conference live, meeting up every year. Obviously, we couldn't miss out on this year. So instead of meeting up on the beautiful island of Lesbos this year, we'll have to do this digital meeting. But obviously, the question which are being raised by the current pandemic crisis are so enormous. We need to talk about that, and we need to get a proper meta-global perspective. So I'm very happy that we managed to get participants really from 5 continents, from 11 countries, and they all, we all going to be in contact and sharing with each other the various perspectives on these crises, because they will definitely have an enormous impact on the way we will live together. And yeah, we've really gone for a long time. I mean, we've been around. I mean, my co-organizers and me, we've known each other for more than 25 years. Evie and Jaime, we met more than 25 years ago in London at King's College, the University of London, where we all spent some time. And so since then, we've been in contact, talking about the impact of emerging technologies, non-dualities, Nietzsche, Heraclitus, and all the various aspects of philosophy and thinking which have been and which still are extremely important to all of us. Then we were doing it as just getting together in the common room, having some drinks, and putting together ideas about the possible futures we're going to live in. Now we still got still the same questions, but hopefully we're doing it more organized, more structured, in a more professional manner. And then finally, well, in 2009, we started with the first Beyond Humanism conference, which took place in Belgrade. And since then, we've met every year, once a year, and basically every 5 years, we had a meeting scheduled in Lesbos. So the first one was the second Beyond Humanism conference, which took place at the University of the Aegean in 2010. The next time we met up in 2015 at the University of the Aegean. And so 2020 was supposed to be the next live meeting, which was scheduled to take place right during these days. We plan to meet up again next year. You see all the announcements on the Beyond Humanism website. One thing I still need to want you to know, please do take into consideration all the great variety of different means we can share our views, our perspectives. I personally directly want to encourage you to also submit your academic articles to the Journal of Post-Human Studies, which James Hughes, Sang-Yi Shin, and I established together in 2017. And since then, 2 issues have been published every year. Then we've got 2 book series, a book series dedicated to post-human studies coming out with Schwabe Publishing, the oldest publishing house in the world. Then another book series coming out with Peter Lang. So please send us your manuscripts and do contribute to the various exchanges in these ways. And now I'm glad, pass on the voice to Evie, and she's going to talk about the 12th Beyond Humanism conference.
Hello, I'm happy to meet you online this year, and I hope we'll all meet live in Lesbos in 2021, like Stefan has already said. Of course, most of you must have read all the thematics of the 12th Beyond Humanism conference that is going to take place in Lesbos. However, I have to give you an outline of the contents of this next conference, especially under the shades that COVID-19 has cast all over us during the previous period. So what we originally had planned about this conference is that it should be a place of discussion about critical post-humanism and transhumanism and their relationship as antagonistic or a relation of convergence. Now we must add a new factor here, the factor of a new era that is rising after the disease that has made us undercome several other considerations. Of course, we were all interested in this convergence that was going to happen between critical posthumanism and transhumanism. And it was based on a series of other factors before the situation. What we still aim at built-in thematics for the next year's conference is reevaluating the contribution of pre-modern and modern, like Spinoza and Bergson, Heidegger, Russell, and others. I'm not reading, but I have to mention some of the main points of the thematics of this conference, like reevaluating Marxist approaches for post-human challenges, and I believe they're becoming more serious after the economical implications of the COVID area. We need to reevaluate phenomenological thought. We need to reevaluate epistemological questions of natural sciences. We need to reevaluate science itself. And we also are on a path of reevaluating the arts and literature in the context of new insights, of post-human, post-COVID insights. The emphasis is to be given to also non-Western cultures in this conference, to philosophies and religions that were not earlier present in the conference, like African culture or Buddhism. We need to focus on immigration and post-human issues. Now, especially that, who knows, we may even have health immigrants as more and more disease is spread, and the notion of disease is changing all over the world. We need new critical approaches to trans-species ontologies, and especially under the new circumstances, and open discussions on potential red lines in the ethical and ontological discussions of technology that are also going to be discussed later in the conversation. To do all this, to prepare all this, we have created the Slack forum. You were invited to participate during the previous weeks. I don't know if the platform is functional for everyone. Of course, there were a lot of platforms and we just had to choose one. It looked simple and it worked simple, no matter if you needed an invitation by us, but it's easy to be done. The platform was created to bridge the gap between this year and next year, while we're getting closer and closer to the new dates of the conference. Jaime is now going to explain to you the thematics posed in the discussion rooms and how you can contribute and develop the discussion there.
Thank you, Evie. Yes. First of all, let me welcome all the people who are saying hello in the chat. People from all over the world, some of them colleagues that many of us know, others that are hopefully also future colleagues. That so hello to everyone. Also for the ones who are waiting in the background of our studio, please kindly wait for your turn there, because now we need to communicate through the platform. So and Jan, who was writing through the chat, you can also join the studio, please, if you wish, and join us in the program presentation. So let me briefly comment, first of all, a couple of special announcements that you can anyway find in the website of the Beyond Humanism Forum, beyondhumanism.org. For instance, we have the great pleasure to share in this conference Stelarc's last project, which is a live installation, which also includes his own performance that already happened, where people can telematically interact. You can find the link in the website. You also have, well, you're also welcome to join my workshop tomorrow at the end, after the end of the conference. You will need for this just to send an email, and I will send you the specific link for that. Evie already mentioned you the Slack forum. You are again more than welcome to join the Slack forum, writing to Evie and be part of these ongoing discussions online. And let me just check if I'm missing something important before moving on to the threads. Of course, there is the Post-Humans Go Viral video channel, which we are actually streaming in. We invite you to also check the other videos that we are posting by multiple intellectuals on this channel. Okay, so I think this is mostly the basic announcements that I should not forget. Now, let me just briefly comment the 7 transversal thematic threads that we have proposed. It's not that we divide each panel. Of course, some panels will focus more on others, but they are meant to be kind of transversal topics of discussion for the whole conference. Now, the first one, Post-Trans-Metahumanisms and COVID-19. You find them anyway in the website, so you can check them afterwards, but let me just introduce them. So we thought it was important to stage the pluralities of different perspectives that a forum like this can provide, considering that mass media narratives tend to be extremely humanistic if we pay attention to the discourse of, say, this idea of saving humanity from the common enemy. There's also a transhumanistic foundation to the way in which digital technologies are taking over even more than usual during the pandemic period. What is then the place for other kinds of discourses, critical post-humanistic discourses, metahumanistic discourses, for a richer kind of more plural discussion around all these topics, including all the main, well, pluralities of perspectives within humanistic, transhumanistic, post and metahumanistic discourses. We will be having a discussion, for instance, with Francesca Ferrando later on, and Yunus Tuncel. Another big topic we wanted to raise is the role of surveillance and control. And is it justified or not to increase surveillance for the sake of health? What is the relation between privacy and freedom? Can they be separated? Issues of ethics of algorithms, and particularly autonomous algorithms and big data, the use of emotions by power, and so forth. What is the relationship, for instance, between necropolitics, biopolitics, and what others like Brian Masumi call ontopower or ontopolitics, digital preemption? So it's a broad landscape of problems. A third axis would be around notions of planetary health, which is a concept I'm promoting lately in terms of, okay, we are talking about health a lot, but what about planetary health, right? What about the planet's health, which might be also crucially related to the systemic outbreak of pandemics, right? Environmental ethics and so forth, in awareness of entanglement at a planetary scale, viruses as planetary agents of evolution, and so forth. Then a fourth axis, which is a greater focus on embodied experience, the role of the body, which of course is already a topic in post-humanism, in critical post-humanism, but I think also even more strongly in the metahumanistic term. Evie, I think you need to mute your microphone because there are noises coming from there. Can you please mute yourself? Sorry, I think we need to bring in these technical issues as part of the conversation. It's a performance online. So, thank you. Good. So now let's continue. And the people who are joining the studio, our speakers, please kindly wait there. You will soon enter the stage. So embodied cognition, richer embodiments, how can we counteract the tendency of digital interface to impoverish experience? How does this come to the fore in confinement? How do bodies rebel in confinement and realize that, no, we need a much richer experience. We were losing a lot, we can gain more. This kind of, well, this and much more we can debate. And actually, for instance, Carmel Veisman's intervention tomorrow about zoomification of life is related to this, but also related to the next topic, the fifth topic, meta-relating in times of COVID, meta-conferencing, working, learning, consuming, prosuming from home. What do we do with this new age of being increasingly bound to fixed points of vision? So how can we create a rich field of experience within the tremendous constraints which are living this richer field of embodied experience that is a conference? A conference is a field. How can we create an experiential field in this medium? It's a great challenge. We're just starting to deal with it. We will see what we can do. For instance, the performance and the workshop tomorrow are attempts in this direction. How can we do critical zooming? Or, of course, now we are choosing precisely another platform different from Zoom. A sixth thread, for which there will be also a panel today, is the 10th anniversary of the Metahumanist Manifesto, which was presented in Lesbos conference 10 years ago. So Stefan and I will talk about our views and evolutions and how and why we think metahumanism is specific and different and relevant in our landscape today. And the seventh thread, which we recently added, is this one we called metaglobal dialogues. If we consider that, well, in this particular forum, we have people from 5 continents and 11 countries, it's, I think, very interesting to, well, reconsider the question of the global, which of course has come to the fore in the pandemic also in very varied and profound ways. How can we, what is meta-global? How can we transcend issues of globality by paying attention to the pluralities, to the irreducible pluralities that no notion of the global can contain? How can we share differences across this forum from this kind of meta-global perspective that does not assume a kind of homogeneity of what the planet is or can be? So this is just a brief outline of the 7 transversal threads. You can, again, find them in the program, and also, more importantly, in the Slack forum, the link of which you also have in the program, which Evie was talking to you about, where you can also share discussions online, written discussions. You can add your views on these topics in the 7 rooms we have created to discuss about this, or you can create your own room with other threads. We are over time already for the introduction, but never mind. we have to deal with the time constraints of these very, well, I think more rigid than usual formats. I think we still need a couple of minutes for going through the program a little bit. Jan was going to do it, but I think he's waiting somewhere in the background. If you are there, you could join the studio, but if you are not there, I will briefly go through the program. So Jan Stasienko was going to do this, but I will take his place. So today we start now with James Hughes. You get first talk at 6 p.m. Central European time. Then we have the dialogue with Francesca Ferrando, and maybe also Yunus Tuncel, though Yunus might join us rather in the final dialogue, in the final conversation, in dialogue with Evie and myself, including a book presentation. Then at 7 o'clock we have Leo Igwe and Keoma Ferreira sharing perspectives from Africa and from Brazil. And then we have at 7:30 the metahumanism discussion between Stefan and myself. Then we will hopefully, if not before, make a pause, right? Because it's otherwise too much to be just all the time sitting in front of the screen. And then we have 1 hour for a final discussion. People who are, all the people in the audience who are seeing and listening now in the chat are invited to, well, you can of course share comments all the time, but especially there will be a time slot for questions and comments within the time slot of each presentation. So you will be invited more specifically to send your questions or comments at that point, although we will try to pick up the others coming up in between. And especially also to join actively the final discussion, especially in the last final hour. So first we will have more discussion between the speakers, and then the final half hour or so with the audience, and sending the questions. Of course, we are thinking a lot about the specificity of these formats, and it's very different to text a small question with a character limit in a chat than sharing your voice in a conference. But we have to play with these limitations, try to make short questions and concise if you can, and we can hopefully address them as best as we can. Tomorrow's program, I think I will read tomorrow. Just bear in mind that the different time ranges we are arranging, it has to do with the fact that we are covering the 5 continents. So today we are focusing on the US and Europe, Africa, and tomorrow we are focusing more Australia, Asia, and Europe and Israel. So this is the reason for the different timings we are having, right? It's a bit of a challenge to cover all these time zones. Okay, I think we are 8 minutes out of time. So I think I will pass now the voice to our other moderator, Chrissy Soteriadis, who will now introduce James Hughes. So thank you to everyone and our colleagues.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. I'm Chrissy, and I'm going to be a moderator and have the lovely opportunity to introduce all the speakers for today. Also, I'd just like to say once again, if you have any questions or comments, please keep them in mind and type them through the YouTube chat after each speaker, and we will try our best to get through some comments. The first speaker of this evening is right here next to me, and I would love to introduce him. This is James Hughes, who will be presenting on the professional managerial class and the politicization of science. James Hughes, the executive director of the Institute for Ethics of Emerging Technologies, is a bioethicist and sociologist who serves as the associate provost for institutional research, assessment, and planning for the University of Massachusetts, Boston. He's also the author of Citizen Cyborg: Why Democratic Societies Must Respond to the Redesigned Human of the Future, and is currently writing a book about moral bioenhancement, which is tentatively titled Cyborg Buddha. So I will pass on the screen to you, James. Thank you.
Delighted to be here. And this topic brings together aspects that started with Citizen Cyborg and before, but that really have come together for me more recently. And let's see if I can get my slides up. See. Oh, let's see. Do you see my slides now? No. Let's see. Stop screen. Share screen. Sorry about this. Do you see, Chrissy, can you tell me if you're seeing slides yet? Application. Oh, here it is. Application window. Okay. Sorry, should have had this figured out before. Okay. So these topics bring together things from my political life and as well as my sociological life. But the initial observation is that things are not going well if you don't have a college degree. The incomes of people with college degrees have been on the decline or been steady. Or the incomes of people with college degrees have been growing while the incomes of people without college degrees have been in decline. Employment prospects for those without college degrees have been worse. During this current corona crisis, people with college degrees have been able to work from home. They have not been laid off. Their incomes have been relatively steady. They're also more likely to wear masks and to socially distance. And as a consequence, education is one of the things that predicts your likelihood of getting COVID-19. People without college educations are more exposed to COVID-19 and have other health risks, and as a result have been at a higher risk of having serious complications from COVID-19. This comes on top of the fact that the deaths of despair have been increasing among people, at least in the United States, and we see some signs of similar trends in places like England, that the amount of economic insecurity that people without college educations have been experiencing over the last decade or two have been increasing their alcohol and drug use in the United States, the opioid crisis, suicide risks, especially for domestic white non-college educated Americans. And it's one of the reasons why we're slipping farther back from the escape velocity that we have been in the transhumanist movement trying to hopefully work towards, to the point at which the life expectancy continues to grow each year, eventually beyond 1 year per year. We're slipping back on that. Life expectancy has stalled for people in industrialized countries as a result of this deaths of despair issue. One of the things that's happened as these class trends between college educated and non-college educated workers have exacerbated is that it's begun to change the nature of our politics. In the past, for the past century, wealth determined pretty much, or was one of the predictors of whether you would adopt an economically populist or an economically redistributive set of politics. And higher education was what predicted for most people whether they were going to adopt a culturally cosmopolitan set of politics on sex, gender rights, on race, on immigration, on a variety of cultural issues. And so if you had higher education and wealth or affluence, you were more likely to end up in some kind of libertarian or neoliberal. If you had less wealth and education, more likely to be a social democrat and so forth. But as we've seen, the growth of hard right populism or proto-fascism throughout the world, not just in the industrialized countries, but throughout the world, has mobilized this other corner of relatively critical of capitalism, although in the United States case, far less straightforward, but relatively critical of traditional neoliberal capitalism, but also extremely culturally conservative. And so one of the things that we have to understand about that is that a lot of the issues, the transhumanists in particular, are concerned with a lot of the kinds of values that, that transhumanism shares with the left Enlightenment. Secularism, scientific and technological optimism, sex, gender equality, anti-racism, and so forth, have now become decoupled politically in some ways from economic populism, the traditional social democratic economic agenda. In the United States, we see as this class divergence between college-educated workers and non-college-educated workers has occurred. We've seen also a polarization of political values and the creation of a much more spread out or even bipolar set of political values in the United States. As blue-collar white workers in the United States defected to the Republicans, they pushed the conservatives even farther to the hard right and even more in a proto-fascist direction. One of the victims of this was that for that sector, 40% of the United States electorate who have subscribed to these proto-fascist views, it's exacerbated the partisanship of science. We've had a long history of partisanship of science since the fights over evolution, teaching of evolution in schools, and so forth. But climate change, sex education fights, gun rights research, the general influence of conspiracism and fake news in American politics, fights over the value of education, fights over the role of expertise. All of these have become highly partisan in the United States to the extent where just walking around here in Chicago, if you wear a mask, you're basically declaring that you're on the left. And if you don't wear a mask, you're basically declaring that you support President Trump. And it's just kind of crazy. Along with that, a long-term trend of people in higher education in particular, and many of the people on the right would blame all these things that I'm talking about on professors, but it's actually far more complicated than that. Although professors are a vehicle for some of these culturally cosmopolitan views, but many professors and educators lean to the left, and that's been increasingly so, and adopting the values of secularism, cosmopolitanism, and so forth. I would also point out that there are psychosocial reasons why people who have high IQ and high open-mindedness lean towards liberal cosmopolitan positions, but that's a longer discussion. But there is self-selection on the part of people into these kinds of values. So the educated people, polling shows, people with college education are more likely to trust science, and they're more likely to be on the left. And educated progressives in particular are even more interested in science and trust science more than people who are on the left but who are not educated. And so through all of this, we see the influence of this anti-technological crystallization of politics on the right, such that if you become a Republican, even if you have a college education, if you become a Republican, you basically drink the Kool-Aid and adopt all the anti-science and technology attitudes of the far right. Now, what does this have to do with the future for transhumanism or enhancement technologies, the things that I've been working on for all these years? How is this going to help play out? We see here this pedophile who Epstein, was that his name? Jeffrey Epstein, who was a funder of transhumanist endeavors, and the accusations of child trafficking networks have been a feature of conspiracy theories for a long time. Turns out there actually were child trafficking networks, and that a prominent transhumanist was involved in them. Peter Thiel, the principal libertarian for Trump, backer from Silicon Valley, is also a principal backer of transhumanist organizations. So we have this new nexus of transhumanist organizations on the right, in the elite politics, in ways that play into conspiracy theories on the right about this. But to take it out of the realm of conspiracy theory, just to look a little bit more at these attitudes that I'm talking about. In 2014, the Pew Foundation found that education level was one of the strongest predictors of Americans' trust and support for a variety of technologies. And here we see the influence of education on views about use of animals in research, nuclear power, genetically modified foods, stricter nuclear power, again, basically climate change, space exploration, so forth. And these correlations between education and these values for Pew held even when they controlled for basic science knowledge. One of the unfortunate things is that in general, education polarizes as well as pushes you in one direction. It pushes you in the culturally cosmopolitan direction, but if you happen to stay on the right, you become even farther to the right. And so actually teaching people about science knowledge sometimes does not have the intended effect that we expect. But being, in general, a college-educated person tends to push you to the left on these cultural and scientific issues. Again, in 2016, the National Science Foundation in the United States found that education was a predictor of interest in scientific discovery, agreement with the federal government should fund science, and confidence in the scientific community, and so forth. And here we have the future shock question from a National Science Foundation survey in 2018. And this is, do you think that science makes life change too fast? And people with high school degrees, 69%, less than high school degrees, 69% say yes. And people with college degrees, only about 40% say yes. So, 15 years ago, I did a series of surveys for the World Transhumanist Association about what things transhumanists basically agreed on and whether we could come up with a kind of defining list of what the transhumanist values were. And the ones that popped out of that research were secularism and humanism, scientific empiricism, technological optimism, a focus on the cognitive status and moral worth being associated with personhood as opposed to simply being human, which plays into abortion politics and other kinds of politics, and a general support for individual rights. So broadly, these are within that culturally cosmopolitan set of worldviews that I had been talking about before. Okay, a brief excursus on class. It's fascinating to me that both transhumanism and Marxism are technological eschatologies. They are Enlightenment, post-Enlightenment views that history is driven by the advance of technology. The transhumanist utopianism about the future tends to be far less deterministic and far less specific about where we're going to end up. Marxism added this eschatological optimism that there would be initially an increase in inequality in society, but then a decline after after capitalism collapsed, basically. And so for the Marxists, the idea that the class structure is currently complex, but will become less complex in the future was a prediction of what would happen both in terms of political economy, growing competition, forcing industries to change in certain ways, corporate concentration, automation and de-skilling, that even though we were currently a complex class structure, eventually we would end up with capitalists and non-skilled workers, and that these skilled categories of workers, their jobs would be de-skilled and their relative autonomy in their jobs would be crushed by corporate concentration and the growing aggressive nature of capitalism. What we saw instead was that did not happen. And as early as 1900, German social democrats like Edward Bernstein were pointing out that socialists should reorient towards a more gradual evolutionary path to socialism because the growing middle classes would allow for a democratic majority to emerge, and that by uniting the middle classes with the working classes, that we could have democratic electoral path to social democracy. After World War II, social democrats in general embraced this strategy because the middle classes continued to grow, and they, for the most part, the social democratic parties jettisoned class struggle for a more technocratic approach to politics. And then in the 1960s, liberation movements erupted in many different quarters of society, and college-educated people were more prone to embrace those liberation movements, specifically liberation movements about anti-racism, which helped drive some blue-collar workers out of social democratic politics and towards the right. And then there began to be this discussion on the Marxist left about whether the professional managerial class is distinct from a working class and has distinct interests. As these college-educated workers have grown as a group within our societies, they now constitute a much more significant electoral majority. They've always been disproportionately politically influential. You see this going back 200 years, the revolutions of 1848, the students and the urban educated skilled workers had different interests than the unskilled workers and the peasants. And in general, people with social capital have always been more interested in liberal democracy reforms than in economic reforms. But now you have a significant constituency, a third of the electorate in most OECD countries, who are college educated. And Piketty has done some work on this. This is the difference between the support from blue-collar workers versus university-educated workers for social democratic parties in France, US, and Britain over the last 70 years. And what you see is that there's an increasing reliance on university-educated workers voting for social democratic parties. Ideologically, meritocracy, I think, is important to point out here. Meritocracy is basically a version of Enlightenment scientific optimism. It is the idea that knowledge is a real thing, it can be known, people who acquire it should be rewarded and trusted, and that's the reason why certain people should be promoted to jobs. If you go back to the discontents with the Tsar in 1900, one of the discontents was that we keep losing these damn wars because everybody in the military is appointed because they're nobles, not because they actually know what they're doing, et cetera, et cetera. Throughout, the good government ideology of the professional managerial class has always been, let's appoint people who actually know what they're doing. And today, you see that being very explicitly rejected by the hard right, who say, A, we don't want a functioning government, and B, we don't definitely by experts. Blue-collar Luddism in this context has some real legs, and that's because blue-collar workers have been hurt harder by the technological changes that have been coming over the last 10, 15, 20 years. In 2016, a survey in the US found that 54% of Americans with a college degree thought that technology had increased their opportunities to advance, but only a third of Americans with no college education thought that. In 2018, US college graduates were found to be twice as supportive of artificial intelligence and its likely benefits, and half as likely to fear losing their jobs to automation compared to those with a college degree. And so having a college degree is, so far, one of the things that has been a way to preserve yourself against the disorienting and economically destabilizing effects of automation and contemporary technology. However, we appear to be poised at a point between COVID and automation and between the rapid onlineification of everything. We appear to be poised at a point where many white-collar occupations are also in danger of automation. This is a matter of great debate, but we see at least what we call proletarianization, pressures on occupations to routinize their jobs and take away their economic benefits, from nurses, teachers, adjunct faculty. More than half of all faculty, university faculty in the United States, do not have long-term full-time benefits. And this has spurred a wave of labor militancy among these bottom strata of the professional college-educated working force. And as a consequence, those people's interests have now been pushed towards the traditional working class, and not in terms of their values, their cultural values, but in terms of their economic interests. So in conclusion, in Citizen Cyborg, I argued that for values reasons, there were reasons for us to come together around an agenda that was both in support of science technology, that part of the Enlightenment agenda, but also in terms of the left Enlightenment agenda of egalitarianism, of greater egalitarianism. This current moment that we're in, where the political polarization that's occurred, the class polarization that's occurred, has also polarized things which are quite central to our interests as techno-optimists or people who want a more scientific future, is a real threat to our agenda. We, as a part of the population, we are not yet 50% of the working force or of the electorate in most OECD countries, much less in the developing world. As a consequence, if we are going to be the defenders, that is college-educated workers, be the defenders of Enlightenment cosmopolitanism, cosmopolitanism, then the proto-fascists are going to win, and they are not going to share that agenda. Although there are many contradictory signs around the world. Modi is more techno-optimistic than, you know, Duterte or whatever, but in general, it's not going to be good for us if the fascists continue to rise. So in order to have to bring back together this cultural agenda with the majoritarian agenda of winning an economic set of reforms, I think we're back to the need for a techno-progressive platform. And we saw inklings of this around the campaign of Andrew Yang in the United States, arguing for a universal basic income. But we also need guaranteed higher education, guaranteed job retraining, guaranteed jobs. We need for longevity medicine, when it's proposed, to be proposed in a way that makes absolutely clear that it will be accessible to everyone. Because we see here a survey that Pew did. They asked American adults, do you think everyone should be able to get longevity treatments? Yes, 80% thought that everyone should be able to get longevity treatments once they're available and safe. But did you think that they will be able to get them? No, only a third of Americans thought that only the wealth would not have access. 66% thought only the wealthy would have access. And that's because we have the most privatized medical system in the world. But even in European countries, you see these kinds of anxieties about the inegalitarian effects of emerging technologies like longevity technology. So hopefully by putting together a program that is both techno-optimistic and scientific, but also egalitarian, we can bring back together these two diverging classes and the two sets of values that they have begun to represent in contemporary politics. Thanks very much.
Thank you, James, for the wonderful talk. And well, now we have a bit of time, not very much for questions. I invite the audience to send questions through the chat. Maybe while they do that, I can start straight away with one, which is, how do you think that the pandemic will affect, for good or bad or transformation, some kind, the different transhumanistic agendas?
I think COVID and this enforced home aloneness of at least the half of the populations that were able to stay home and were able to socially distance and took it seriously, this has got to have a profound psychosocial effect. This has been like a 4-month meditation retreat for many people about the nature of contemporary life. You see this in the celebration of videos of animals returning to cities and to native, formerly native places. So I think many people expect this to be an inflection point in global civilization. I do as well. I think it's such a fraught period because of the rise of fascism that authoritarian solutions, and you see this even in the concerns on the right about mask laws and so forth, that this is a move by elites to see how much authoritarianism can be forced down people's throats. But in a way, they're right. This is a situation in which people like Viktor Orban in Hungary are imposing new neo-fascistic policies that they wouldn't have been able to get away with if it hadn't been for COVID. So I think we have to be very cognizant that things could go in a dystopian direction as a result of COVID. But I think that in general, the results are going to be quite positive. I mean, one of the observations is, isn't it interesting that capitalism grinds to a halt when we only buy the things that we really, really need? Right? And what does it mean to suddenly declare, Andre Gorch back in the 1980s said, maybe one of the ways that we could get rid of work is we just figure out what's essential work to do and we divvy that up to everybody. And then if automation takes that away, we just shrink it back down and eventually we're all working 10 hours a week. Well, we just decided in every society who the essential workers were, what the essential work was. It turns out that it's packing groceries and auto deliveries, but it wasn't the things that Andre Gorch was thinking about, industrial work or whatever. But essential work, now that we've defined it, this can be a key to moving forward to a future with less work.
Thanks. I don't know if Chrissy wants to jump in with moderation. I identified a question by Kevin that he reminded us about. Do you want to pick it up? So I can pick it up if you want. So Kevin was previously asking, Kevin Lagrander, I will put it in the... So what about a robot tax, as Bill Gates suggested? And there is a continuation in order to compensate those who are displaced. So the tax proceeds go to the displaced.
Well, I think a robot tax has a complicated political path because on the one hand, it's clearly a way to say we recognize that there's going to be a problem with automation and that we should take the wealth that's created by these technological changes in society and put them towards universal social benefits that will address some of the dislocations that are brought about by automation. That's great. On the other hand, from a techno-optimistic or a techno-progressive point of view, we don't want to disproportionately tax and discourage the kinds of technologies which are actually leading us in a positive direction. If we have a vision of a future with less work, we in fact perhaps should be encouraging that the automation technologies, the displacement technologies occur. We still have to be cognizant of creating a society in which people can continue to pay their bills and continue to feel economic security even with those economic dislocations. But I think that those tax burdens should really be more universal. They should be progressive income taxes instead of robot taxes. So as a consequence, I'm not actually supportive of the robot tax. I'm supportive of the dialogue about why we would need a robot tax, but not of a robot tax in particular.
I see. We welcome more questions to come in. We will be having a dialogue with all the speakers at the end. Jaime, do you see any other questions?
Yeah, there was another question there. I would say that we will keep more questions for the end, but there was one more here. This one from Ioanna Stamati. How much does the COVID-19 environment has called today the new normality and systemic racism lives through the education system was the cause of birth of Black Lives Matter movements? I'm not sure.
Well,
so about the relation, right, with COVID-19 and the Black Lives Matter movement.
I think the nature of racial capitalism is still needs a lot of unpacking, a lot of discussion about what's race and what's class. The disproportionate burdens that people without college educations experienced because of COVID, both in terms of loss of employment, inability to work from home, and inability to socially distance, inability to believe in social distancing, all these things were class factors that I was pointing to essentially, but they were also racial dynamics. African Americans in the United States were also disproportionately at risk from COVID and at risk from income loss and so forth. But I think that I would also point to the idea that, as David Brin pointed out many years ago, the way to address growing surveillance is growing surveillance, surveillance from the bottom. We wouldn't have Black Lives Matter if it wasn't for the fact that we're all carrying around cameras and videography equipment that allowed us to take pictures of police brutality and share it with the world in real time. And during these last 4 months, a lot of us were spending a lot more time online. And as a consequence, even white Americans were shocked by these images, by the Floyd murder was so horrific. In 10 seconds, you saw this man being murdered. And of course, it had a tremendous transformative effect. But I would say it's a combination of these dynamics of racial capitalism and the growing economic insecurity of and precarity of the American working class, and apparently the global working class, because immediately the Black Lives Matter protests exploded all over the world as well. And the fact, this technological moment that we're in, where we can actually take pictures of state repression and share it with people in real time.
Well, thank you so much. I think we need to move on. I invite people to also join the final discussion where James will also be, and we can keep the dialogue running.
Thank you.
Welcome, Francesca.
Thank you so much, Jaime.
I will just do a little quick introduction for the speakers. Here we have Francesca Ferrando, who teaches philosophy at NYU Liberal Studies, New York University. She is a leading voice in the field of post-human studies and has been the recipient of numerous honors and recognitions. Her latest book, Philosophical Posthumanism, has just been released as a paperback, and US magazine Origins named her among the 100 people making change in the world. Alongside Professor Ferrando, we have Sampanikou, who is a professor of art, history, and visual culture at the Department of Cultural Technology and Communication at the University of the Aegean, Mytilene, Lesvos, Greece, and is a founding member of Beyond Humanism Conference Series. She has published several books and articles, and among them, recent Sampanikou editor of the audio-visual Post-Humanism Cambridge Scholars Press of 2017, and is now compiling with Jan Stasienko, a reader on post-humanism. Along with Jaime, they will be having a dialogue on post-trans-metahumanisms and COVID-19, the differences, antagonisms, and relations.
Great. Well, thanks, Francesca, Evie, for, so I think because we have several things to do in this slot, including the presentation of Francesca's book, right? Right. But maybe since we are dealing in this panel with one of the main, the first of the 7 thematic threads that we have proposed for the conference, of course, it's a very open thread. Like one could approach it from endless perspectives, like how, what different perspectives can post-trans or metahumanism provide around the COVID-19 pandemic. We can unfold some of them during the conversation. For instance, one of them would be the different, say, imbalances, not just because there might be relations, there might be dissonances and even antagonisms between these 3 currents, or plus humanism, or there might be also imbalances. Say, for instance, is humanism overwhelmingly present in media, in the general discourse? Is transhumanism also partly very present in the actual technology of the media and in the increase of digital, the digital shift being accelerated through the pandemic? Is instead critical posthumanism and metahumanism, of course, even more, much more minoritarian kind of field? How does that balance restage itself in the academy and so forth? So there are, I think, obvious and important power imbalances, although, of course, for some people of the audience and maybe for many of our colleagues, it might be also interesting to even, well, define what we think humanism, post-humanism, transhumanism, or metahumanism are. I will address this also partly in the metahumanism panel. But so just as a, well, brief staging, I hope we can start discussing about this. I know that Francesca wanted also to share a text, maybe to start the reflection. So I just pass the words to both of you, and let's keep it going. And whenever you wish, we move on to the book presentation, of course.
Thank you so much, Jaime, for your wonderful inputs. Thank you so much, Evie, for being part of the conversation, for organizing this. Thanks, Christina, for the introduction, and everyone for connecting today. I feel really, really honored, truly delighted, and really lucky to have this community. This moment, this historical moment, COVID-19, has been, for me, an extremely generative and a regenerative period of my life. It brought me back into existence with wide open eyes. And I'm actually writing my 2nd book on these reflections, which is dedicated to this community, specifically this community, which was here when I most needed it. So I wrote the dedication to the community, and I would like to share it with you right now because it really expressed what was my experience of COVID-19. And then, of course, from the individual, we're going to go to the social, from the social to the species, and from the species to the planet. So if you don't mind, it's going to take 4 minutes. I check with the time. If you don't mind, I'm going to read it for you. Is that good?
Okay.
Yeah? Okay.
Go on.
All right, this is a call of gratitude, and is also an expert from my 2nd book, which is entitled Post-Human Agency, Social Wisdom for the 21st Century. Being a post-human scholar during the COVID-19 pandemic, with many social, biological, and ecological issues, vigorously coming to the surface is a challenge and a gift. This historical moment made many recognize the urgency for academic philosophy to become social wisdom. Once we realized that people around us were dying and that we could die as well, the fragility of humanity, as well as the urgency for authenticity and meaning, became self-evident. We had to ask, is posthumanism just another academic trend? If that was the case, many would have probably lost their interest in the field. Facing the sense of finitude, we were searching for something deeper than scholastic novelty. We delved into this as individuals and a community. We organized online events, forums, and respected each other's solitudes. Social distancing allowed us to look deeper into ourselves and our philosophies. Was posthumanism something that could help us navigate this moment? We could only be honest to ourselves because there was no one to give account to. This was not an exam. It entailed no promotion. It was not about the ego. This was our life. During social distancing, we were surrounded by ourselves. Each action, thought, and word resonated much wider because space has suddenly shrunk, but not time. We had unlimited time in limited space. Like in a cave, words resonate. Like in a reverse myth of the Platonic cave, someone who was previously lost in constant activities, social interactions, and projects now had to enter the cave and stay. A challenging separation from loved ones. A precious possibility to hear ourselves. We did it, and we could only be radically honest. In this observation, the question arose, what about posthumanism? Some of us accessed posthumanism as an intellectual approach. They struggled with finding meaning, now that much was lost. Some of us realized that posthumanism is a way to exist. In this sense, posthumanism allows us to approach this historical moment as a species, help us navigate it on a personal level, and gives us the strength and vision to be agents of change in the realization of a post-COVID world. This meeting witnesses the transformation of an academic philosophy into social wisdom for the 21st century. Thanks for being here. Thanks for being part of the wave. Thanks for making a difference in this world. Thanks. So I just really want to thank all of you because you have been inspiring my life, and in this extremely challenging moment, you as a community were there, and you were there with your insights, with your doubts, with your questions, with your existential insights, and I truly appreciate it. And I think we did incredible. You know, this moment, as challenging as it was, really brought us together, and in total radical honesty, because there was, again, this was not anymore about just writing a paper or getting the next academic job. It was about our life, about our existence. And we knew that our life could end, or someone that we love, their life could end. So what about posthumanism? And I think that really brought posthumanism like a deep change, not just an academic trend anymore. This is a real philosophy, a love for wisdom. This is why in my second book, in the title, I call it a social wisdom for the 21st century.
You're always inspiring us, Francesca. The interaction with you is always a magical thing to happen. So I have to thank you that you're here tonight, and I'm glad that internet connection finally was repaired where you are. So all the things you just mentioned are very deep and are a reflection of all your insights. The insights always appear in your books, in your writings, your talks, everywhere else. And this is how you always give us your different approaches in the several Beyond Humanism conferences. If I have to speak about me and how I had to deal with the COVID period, I would add that for me, well, it was like the end of technology had happened. It was the outcome of the abuse of nature. And this was the real end of the period we call humanism. A period that a new critical post-humanism is about to rise. On the other hand, as it was a period of deep thought for a lot of us, for all of us, probably, it brought forth several readings of the past and several artistic insights. We hadn't or had for a long time not shared with the artists, because arts is the field where I come from and the field I interact with. I mostly interact with audiovisual arts. And you see, last year in Lille, I had presented a documentary about a philosophical project that took place to Gavdos, an island south of Crete. Actually, the southern part of Europe, the southern limit of Europe. The experiment was shot in a documentary that took part in an international festival. A documentary made by a Greek artist, Geros Moustakis, with Nikos Labot in 2016, following the lives and philosophy of 7 Ukrainian scientists that, after the Chernobyl accident, moved to Gavdos, lived there, created a school of Pythagorean thought, and enriched it with Eastern philosophy's insights, plus adding to their whole vision the importance of language and communication in everyday life. So they created a triptych of numbers and algorithms, plus communication, plus language as an important part of our being, of our living, plus the ability of find inner treatment. And this inner treatment was the first thing that came up to my mind during the COVID period. And it was a good initiative for several discussions related to technology, to medicine, and nature. That is a different triptych now after the COVID area. There are a lot of things to mention from this whole philosophical project that has really impressed me. However, if I had to select one or two passages from this philosophy, I would like to mention, for example, in their own words, the scientists mention that, for example, philosophy must come before activity. It is in the nature of the laws of constructing the world, build the world, I build the world, and it happens. This is a unique characteristic of the human, to build worlds. So, building worlds moves you to the idea of immortality, an idea very popular to the transhumanists, but an idea that receives a new meaning now in the post-COVID era. What is immortality finally? And do we want it to be achieved, and how can it be achieved? It exists in a lot of philosophies and religions as idea. It exists in the transhumanist philosophy as immortality of the body, actually, not the soul, as in the religion. But as post-humanism, as humanists, do we have to separate it from, for example, human immortality against animals' mortality? Animals undergo several natural laws. They mutate. They die. Humans can also mutate and get different shapes, but they mutate in different ways. They change. This mutation can be an inner change sometimes, and it's better if it is achieved. In humans' ability is, I mean, among human abilities is the ability to get treatment and not to die, to postpone death for a while. If we think of critical posthumanism now under such perspectives, I would say that the essence of being posthuman must not depend on technology itself, or only technology, or exclusively, I mean, on technology. It can achieve through entirely human methods. It's to say human in many aspects that actually lie into human nature. Language and communication is part of this human ability. I think the most important. Science based on numbers and algorithm plus language plus communication. I think that it could be a safer path, or a most realistic path to making a shift from the Homo sapiens to a really immortal human being. But I think this could be a good point for us to also bring forth your book. Unless Jaime has something to add here.
Well, I mean,
Yeah,
before ending with the book in this slot, I could briefly comment, well, some very few of the many ideas which I would like to share, why I think post-trans-metahumanist debates could be very relevant in this context. I think there is a great need to counteract prevailing discourses in the media, in common sense, in the legal systems, in the political systems, and in the predominant technological systems. I think there's a strong need to counteract this kind of humanistic undertone in media that the virus is a sort of alien enemy, common enemy to humanity that needs to be killed. We are forgetting everything. We are forgetting the fact that viruses are a crucial aspect and motor of evolution, and that we are the offspring of viruses, right? So taking on this humanistic tone of, fighting the evil enemy of humanity is just reinforcing the very system of oppression and domination that is actually making pandemics to outbreak all the time, because this is, of course, not the first time. So another issue that I think needs to be strongly counteracted is the kind of discourse closer to transhumanism, even if of course there are people like James Hughes in transhumanism who are critical and interested in democratic developments. But I think if we consider the fact that the largest corporations on the planet, which are the technology corporations, for instance, Google, have an explicit transhumanistic agenda, explicit and implicit. So Google, now Alphabet, has got a whole branch of companies which are dealing with longevity and so forth. And then they have the well-known products that are, I think, a new mode of colonialism, a hyper radical colonialism, which is expanding the humanistic colonial project. So humanism, I think, was always already a colonial project. And at least these branches, which are the predominant branches, in my view, of transhumanism, are hyper-colonial in many ways. So in face of this, of how, for instance, Google's project of hyper-colonialism and of life extension and so forth is presented as something without alternatives, as something that is inevitable and desirable, I think this places a highly problematic global condition. It relates also to, say, the Facebook model of sociality. The Facebook model implies a kind of implicit social credit system where everybody is evaluating everyone else, where you're just getting scores for everything you do, where you're overexposing yourself and surveying others. So it's I would call it, quite honestly, a hyper-fascist social condition, the most problematic side of which is precisely how it's become a global desired condition. It appears to be desirable and inevitable. And I think all of these factors need to be radically counteracted. It is not acceptable under any circumstance that we just take for granted this kind of dogma. And this is where I think critical posthumanism and metahumanism and maybe many other intellectual branches have a lot to say in accounting for contestable futures, as Stelarc was calling them in our meeting in Seoul. Contestable futures, not a single-minded singularity future, not a single-minded humanistic colonial project. No, contestable plural futures and presents is what we need. Then we need to account for how we are entangled with planetary scale metabodies, as I call them, fields of relational movements. For instance, the viral metabody, which I was mentioning previously. Well, I will later be claiming the rights of viruses to continue, proliferating biodiversity on Earth. And then there is the algorithmic metabody, right? What kind of metabody is this? I think it's the opposite of the viral metabody. It's not a metabody of mutations. It's not a movement of mutation. It's a movement of reduction. It's a will to total control of radical acceleration, which is, I think, having a radically destructive impact on the outcome of 4 billion years of biodiversification that viruses and bacteria have enacted. So this kind of entanglement that we have with planetary scale metabodies, with how we are the offspring of an evolutionary process, which is a hybridization of bacteria and viruses.
Jaime, you froze. Maybe, yeah, while Jaime...
We are the chimeric offspring of hybridization of bacteria, and should be very thankful to.
It seems we're having a little bit of difficulty with Jaime.
There's a technical problem here.
In the meantime, I think we could actually just answer maybe one of the questions, because we have a few coming up. We have one particular question for Professor Ferrando by Prof. Kevin Lagrandeur, who asks, could you say how...
yes, sorry, I have to apologize. The problem with this connections is that sometimes they can break. So let me just...
Maybe I can answer this question and then Jaime can finish. Yeah, so Christian, what was the question? Sorry.
We were speaking about, so how can posthumanism help us today in some
yes,
sort of...
hello, I have to...
Jaime, we're having a bit of difficulty connecting with you.
I have to apologize because, well, I'm using the mobile connection, and whenever a call comes in, I get lost.
Seems that he's back on track.
So, well, we have to deal with the vicissitudes of online connection. So this is the kind of entanglement with planetary scale ecologies that we need to account for. I mean, in this regard, this humanistic dream of, let's consider briefly how the immortality question, which takes so much effort in some transhumanistic agendas and also in Google's agenda and all these companies of life extension and so forth, how it relates to a whole millennia-long tradition since Parmenides, the Greek philosopher, of despise of the body, despise of becoming, transformation, and movement. So this idea that identity is a fixed thing, which I think is a pretty outrageous idea. I think that our identity is our plasticity. The identity of the world is the plasticity of the world. The brain, how can you conceive that the brain is just a set of existing patterns that can get reproduced? The brain per se is defined by its plasticity. That is the wonderful force of the brain and of the body and of our body intelligence. So this is the kind of thing I want to claim. I will be claiming them more later in the metahumanism panel as well. But I think many of these assumptions that identity is something really that we take for granted as a fixed thing, that the disembodied mind is associated to this identity, again, as a heritage of the dreadful Cartesian tradition. All these assumptions that are underlying humanistic and I think also largely transhumanistic discourses need to be challenged to the bone. And this is, I think, what critical posthumanism and metahumanism can provide for a rich discussion for more plural futures. I will stop here. I could continue for hours on this. So please, Chrissy, come in with the questions, and sorry for...
Jump back in. Just to actually piggyback on what you were saying, we have a question posed to Francesca here saying, could you say how posthumanism helps us today in some sort of practical way? Interested in an example, if you could expand upon that.
Sure. Thank you so much, Chrissy, for bringing this question, and thank you so much, Kevin, for asking the question. So I think that posthumanism can really help us in many ways. The first way to help us is really understanding what's happening on planet Earth and on the human species right now. And I would connect to some of the things that were said both by Jaime and by Evie. So in that sense, yes, we are the result of the evolutionary development of the human in relation to bacteria, to viruses. For instance, placenta is a great example of that. Placenta form in the human species because of the interaction with specific viruses that we had encountered back in history. So the point is, first of all, understanding us in relation to the big picture. So we are not a species that can think of its own species. Of course, there is more to say about this. So the way we have been thinking of humanity has not been any way a egalitarian way. You know, the way society has been constructed has been hierarchical, dominational, etc., etc. But furthermore, if we add anthropocentrism to the picture, we realize that at least in the couple of centuries, many societies have been thinking of the human in separation from other species from the planet. So for instance, if we think of COVID-19 and we go back at the, let's say, between the Keoma beginning, there are different possible outcomes. One is that some humans were eating specific animals. That's how the human species got it. Other theories are maybe, you know, connected more to human labs, etc., etc. In both cases, there is a specific human action that brought this virus that was not really within the human species, with the human species. So the point here is that on one side, for me, COVID-19 is really pushing us with force, with strength, with bodies to realize that we can no longer think of the human in separation from, for instance, from the oikos. Oikos, Greek home. This is not just a home that we inhabit. We are it. I like in this sense Alan Watts. We are the fruit coming out of the earth like a tree bringing up apples. We are the apples. So we cannot think of us in separation from other species, in separation from the biosphere. So in that sense, also going back to also Evie, she was saying that COVID-19 really brought us not just in relation to technology, but in relation to ecology. In the sense, I think it's time for us as humans to realize that we need to respect non-human lives in many ways. Can come from our diets, can come from creating more and more space where humans are not allowed, so that other species can flourish. Wildlife, it's important. This earth doesn't belong to us. We are part of this. So this is, Kevin, for me, it's a great way that Post-Trans really can help us navigating this moment. And then, of course, there are more layers, technological aspect that, Jaime was mentioning. There is more to say. I don't want to take more time because I know that we are a little bit out of time already, but I think one great insight, Kevin, is really realizing of the human really post-anthropocentric. COVID-19 shows us that we are not separated and we need to really relocate ourselves in the big picture.
And maybe because I think we need to shift to the book, but maybe we can pick the other question, which I think is, can you put it there, Chrissy, please? There's about flesh and the body. Let me just briefly say that I think the other big issue, besides together with the planet, is the body. I think what I do think that is a promising issue of confinement is that people realize that the body is there and that it requires care, that it requires more richness, that you can't just stay all day clicking on screens as Mark Zuckerberg might want us to be. So I see a little seed for potential revolutions there of a return of the body. Maybe my hope is that maybe the virus arrived too soon in this digital shift, in this radical transformation towards increasingly immobile bodies, and that we realize that we need to do the reverse to bring back a richer embodied experience, which is what I largely try to do in my work. Besides.
And I would add to this, the point is that we are always going to have bodies. Every kind of entity, in order to manifest on this dimension, needs some type of embodiment. And to me, if it's a biological embodiment, if it's a technological one, it matters, but it also doesn't matter. It's still a type of body. So this idea that, okay, just let's go past biological and everything is going to be solved, it's really an illusion. It's not a utopia, it's an illusion. Because once you are into a technological body, which may happen, it's already happening. I do think that the network, I do think that internet is alive. So there is already life in the digital realm, but there are going to be issues there as well. There are going to be, there are viruses already in the digital realm. So to me, the question is not so much just shift, or this body doesn't work anymore. That doesn't really mean anything because we are not in separation from the body. But you can say, okay, let's try to envision an existence where biological is gone. There are going to be other issues. That's why I think the real way to go about it is really being wise, realizing that we're all always going to be part of a big picture, and technology also is a type of embodiment, also needs physical bodies. Think of the big machines that store all the information. The clouds are not the clouds, really. The data are placed in big storages that are, taking spaces from other type of life. So what I would say is that we may, the dream is like, okay, let's just get rid of the biological bodies, switch to technological bodies. For me, it's not an answer, because the point is any type of body is going to have their own issues, maybe slightly different. So the point for me is really merge yourself in the situation where we are at and see. and see what's happening, because by seeing what's happening in the present moment, you're going to have deep insights about existence itself.
And for me, if I may add something, for me, it cannot be just a matter of flesh. It is a matter of mind. It's a matter of spirit, mainly. A spirit that leads you to be opened to nature, to realize that you're a part of it, and to think in a trans-species way. Okay.
Yeah, well, just quickly, I think, yeah, indeed, I agree with Francesca. There's always a body. The problem is how rich is that body. I think that very often certain technological bodies, not all, are extremely poor bodies. And that is the problem. The reduction is the very reason why they become dominant and destructive. So what we need is richer kinds of embodiment for richer and more open-ended and plural kinds of lives. I think we are really out of time. There are questions. I would invite speaker audience also to come back in the final. There's one from Fabrizio and other people. Let's try to, because we need to do a brief, and we are totally out of time, the book presentation, but please keep your questions for the end if possible, and we will try to come back to them fully. Sorry if we can't deal with all of them. Could we do a very quick book too, because we're really totally out of time.
Absolutely. So let me just give a really short presentation. This is the book, Philosophical Posthumanism. I hope you can see the image, prefaced by Rosi Bredotti. Came out as a hardcover last year, 2019, extremely expensive. I did not agree with the price. I love Bloomsbury, great publisher. I don't agree with that kind of prices. I'm very happy that it just came out this week as a paperback with a very decent price. You can also find the ebook on Bloomsbury website for $17. The book itself, it's all based on question and answers. So it's a really good guide for people who are starting to learn about posthumanism, but also for the people who are really already in the discussion. It talks about posthumanism, transhumanism, anti-humanism, new materialism, object-oriented ontology. What are the differences? What are the similarities? And then focuses more specifically on philosophical posthumanism, explaining it through these three layers. As a post/humanism, which means we are many, we are diverse. The human species cannot be universalized in one person. We are all different and we're all part of the species. Number two, post-anthropocentrism. It is time to move on from an anthropocentric point of view. COVID-19 really shows us that there is no space, no time anymore to be anthropocentric. And third one is post-dualism. Even if you go beyond racism and sexism and ethnocentrism and anthropocentrism, if we keep being dualistic, there is no way out. We're always going to be issues, always going to have issues. So very important to really learn from the posthumanist philosophy of entanglements, of intra-relation, intra-changes, interconnectivity. We are many. We are constantly changing. We are waves in the oceans. We are part of a large picture. We are the picture. And this is, of course, connected to many, traditional wisdom. Already the Upanishads, in many centuries before the Common Eras, were saying, you are the universal picture. You cannot think of yourself as a small identity. And this is something that it's really blocking you from understanding who you really are, because you are many. Now, again, we don't have much time to talk about it. We will have more events related to the book. I'm so grateful again to all the community, to this community that is mentioned in the acknowledgements, because it was, I really had the chance to develop my ideas in all these years together, developing this incredible philosophical source of wisdom, and also a wisdom of the 21st century, which is my second book.
However, I have to say a few things about your book, if I have 1 or 2 minutes. Or, Jaime? Do we still have time?
Please, yes, one.
I'll be very short, because I would like to... I understand that we're late. Okay, I would like to say that one of the greatest virtues of this book is exactly this attempt to establish widely acceptable terminology of the post-human, to describe it, rather. That is also an attempt to set limits and take distances from former interpretations based on the transhuman as a central point of the post-humanist universe. And Francesca makes a difference here with this book. I think that Francesca Ferrando is nowadays a leading scholar in the area of, we all know her, of post-humanism, following new paths, also very close to Eastern philosophies, bridging them in a way with Western philosophies, and thus making us wiser by giving us wider visions on the post-human. Okay, I think time is very limited.
Yes, yes. We'll come back to these questions at the end as well.
Okay.
We have more coming up. I would like to introduce the other speakers, if I may.
Let's move on.
Let me do so and bring them to. Yes, we have our global perspectives coming on, and we have here with me on screen, we have Leo Igwe from Nigeria and Keoma Ferreira. Both will be giving us presentations and post-human perspectives on COVID from an African perspective, from Leo Igwe. And just a short, quick introduction. He's a Nigerian human rights advocate and humanist. He's a former Western and Southern African representative of the International Humanist and Ethical Union, and has specialized in campaigning against and documenting the impact of child witchcraft accusations. He's also appointed as a research fellow of the James Randi Educational Foundation. And I will introduce Keoma thereafter when it's his turn to speak. So without further ado.
All right. Thank you so much for this opportunity to interact with all of you. I must say that, yes, I find the idea of post-humanism and transhumanism very fascinating. So what I'm going to do in the next couple of minutes is an exercise in intellectual fascination, but with regard to COVID-19. Now, a pandemic that has threatened to extinct humanity provides an ample opportunity to envision possible futures and explore post-human permutations. This is because amidst the gloom and despair, fears and anxieties over human survival, it is compelling that humans begin to reimagine and reconceive the human. It's imperative that speculations about the future engage and move beyond human vulnerabilities, or make those vulnerabilities a point of focus and see how we can fix them. Holding out some hope and optimism about the future and about the human. So a post-human take on the coronavirus pandemic is quite pertinent, especially for Africa, a region that has been predicted will be most affected by COVID-19 and is most vulnerable to any other human extincting health disaster or catastrophe. Just a moment. Now, although the surge in the infection rate that many predicted has not materialized, the region is no less vulnerable to epidemics and pandemics that could threaten human existence and survival in the region. First, any speculation about redesigning or technologically augmenting the human is both cogent and promising, and laden with opportunities and possibilities that is worthy of a scholarly reflection. Now, a pandemic rattles Africa. The outbreak of COVID-19 caused so much fears and panic, and it still causes so much fears and anxieties across Africa and, of course, across the world. Drastic and unprecedented measures have been put in place to contain the spread of the virus. Social distancing, a ban on international and domestic flights, prohibition of public gathering at parks and churches and schools. The pandemic has posed a serious challenge to African politics and politicians, African economics and healthcare sectors. According to WHO, the first reported case of COVID-19 in Africa was on February 14, And since then, 52 countries have reported cases. African countries still lag behind the rest of the world in testing and monitoring of the disease. In my country, Nigeria, the number of confirmed cases has continued to rise. Very few tests have been conducted due to limited number of testing equipment and personnel in the country. So like the Ebola virus, COVID-19 has revealed the fragile, weak healthcare capacities, not just in Nigeria, but in African countries. It has revealed the technological deficit in various sectors. Now, the UN Economic Commission on Africa has projected that between 300,000 and 3 million Africans will lose their lives as a result of COVID-19. However, it noted that this projected impact could be affected by intervention measures in various countries. Now, these grim prospects for the region are predicated on so many factors, including overcrowding and poorly serviced slum dwellings in urban areas, limited access to hand-washing facilities, informal workforce, undernourishment, underlying health conditions such as tuberculosis and HIV and AIDS, and extreme poverty. In addition, there is a challenge posed also by snake oil sellers who take advantage of the people, because lack of cure for this disease has provided an opportunity for quacks and con artists to peddle fake therapies for the virus, fake therapies for the disease. So that we have in Ghana and Nigeria reports that traditional healers, operators of health clinics, and pastors market spurious remedies and questionable cures for COVID-19. So as we have noted, COVID-19 poses a serious challenge to African countries in the area of testing. Now, as of June 29, Nigeria, a country of over 200 million persons, has carried out a little over 130,000 tests. 130,000 people have been tested. So let's assume that Nigeria, excuse me. Let's assume that Nigeria can carry out a million tests at the end of the year. How long will it take to test half the population of the country? 100 million people. So it's going to take us how many years? Now, the same situation applies to Zambia, that reported the first 2 cases of COVID-19 in March. And in May, this country, which has about 17 million people, has conducted only 20,000 tests. Only 20,000 people have been screened out of 17 million. While in Kenya, the number of tests was 45,000. And they need 537,713 tests. These tests are required to cover 1% of the population. So they have not even tested up to 1% of the population as at now. Now, Belinda Herring of the WHO has noted that there is a lack of necessary infrastructure to tackle COVID-19. So African countries lack the equipment and trained human resources. There are also lack of the reagents that are needed to do these tests. Now, to carry out these tests, African countries, they depend on other countries, European countries, the United States, to send or sell the resources to them. They rely on the WHO to make available the testing materials, the training, and tracking facilities. Now, even with the existing support from other countries and the WHO, African countries still need a technological leap to contain and combat the coronavirus pandemic. Now, the various technologies need to converge and combine in ways that could signal hope and enhance the healthcare capacity and accelerate testing and treatment processes. But as it stands now, the COVID-19 management status quo in Africa is anything but smart and anything but capable of getting these countries to defeat the pandemic. So some countries have trained materials. The situation we have now is that some countries have trained human resources, but they don't have enough testing kits. In fact, I just received a message from my WhatsApp that Nigeria has gotten 34,000 training kits. Look, Nigeria is about 200 million people. So we have 34,000 training kits that have just arrived, and that's the announcement. So how many people are going to be tested with 34,000 training kits? So there are countries who may have training kits, but they don't have enough personnel. Or sometimes the machines will break down. So some countries have laboratories for tests, but not enough reagents or protective devices for the scientists and health workers. So the effective management of COVID-19 is predicated on revamping the health infrastructure in African countries and making possible and making available cutting-edge health technologies for testing, monitoring, and treatment of the disease. For instance, in Nigeria, the technology for testing and management of COVID-19 should be available and accessible to the country's 200 million people, not just less than 1 million as currently the case. Yeah, it has to be available as, let's say, the cell phones. And people should be able to get devices to test themselves. Now we have about 34,000 kits arriving somewhere in Abuja, and they're going to use that for the politicians, relatives of the politicians, and the people other people will keep waiting for years. So with the current infrastructure, it is evident that African countries are incapable of meeting the targets of combating and containing COVID-19 and other life and human-threatening epidemics and pandemics. African countries need to transition into more technology-mediated societies that, that can, they need to harness scientific and technological innovations, emerging technologies, including robotics, nanotechnology, gene therapy, stem cell therapy, artificial intelligence, in combating this disease. So to rattle the COVID-19 management status quo in the region, there's a need for convergence of technologies. You see, we have a situation whereby we have either the reagents are there, the laboratories are in one place, we have limited training personnel, all these things, sometimes you have one, you don't have the other. So there needs to be some convergence of all these technologies in a way that blurs the line in between these technologies and in between the humans and the technology, so that we can scale up efficient and effective management of the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Leo Igwe. Now we're going to actually change this perspective and bring on Keoma Ferreira, who's going to bring us a perspective from Brazil. He will be presenting, is this pandemic crisis provoked by only a biological virus? And a little quick 2 words about him. He's a transhumanist philosopher, doctorate student on philosophy by UFRN. He's the US Transhumanist Party Brazil's ambassador and TAFFD's Brazil's ambassador. And I will give the stage to you, Keoma.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me for this forum, fantastic forum. And very happy to be here with so fantastic thinkers. The coronavirus is transforming again the whole world. SARS in 2003 and MERS in 2012 showed to mankind the potential of this group of viruses. Surprisingly, we are perplexed again. This time, more than in previous outbreaks, we are seeing in some countries the dichotomic reality of public health versus economics. Maybe this pandemic is not the core of problem itself. It is a symptom of another much more perverse issue. When we perceive that exists much more preoccupation about the loss of jobs than the loss of lives, we should recognize that this illogical and immoral thinking that can pervade all of us is not provoked by the SARS-CoV-2. I do not intend to try to identify or propose a solution to this real problem. My question is, are we using all our scientific knowledge to overcome this catastrophic situation? If the question was addressing the political efforts to do it, we could answer quickly with a clear no. Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil and Donald Trump in the USA are provoking an exponential rising of infected people by continuing to encourage the depletion of social isolation. However, when we are talking about science, although there are some disagreements between researchers, there is always the presumption that we are always receiving the best results. But it is true. Recently, the Journal of Infectious Diseases and Epidemiology published an article corroborating the use of a specific treatment for COVID-19. At the conclusion, the authors, Robert J. Rowan and Howard Robbins, wrote, quotation, "Many viruses require reduced sulfhydryl groups for cell fusion and entry. Coronaviruses, including SARS-CoV-2, are rich in cysteine, which residues must be intact for viral activity. Sulfhydryl groups are vulnerable to oxidation. Ozonotherapy, a very inexpensive and safe modality, may safely exploit this critical vulnerability in many viruses, inclusive of SARS-CoV-2. The road already has a most inexpensive, safe, and likely effective remedy for deadly viral diseases, which exploits their redox vulnerability at critical membrane cysteine tryptophan fusion sites. Ozonotherapy could be easily deployed worldwide, even in very poor countries. With few conventional treatments for viral pneumonia, this epidemic could provide impetus to study ozonotherapy very ethically under the auspices of an institutional review board and treating. Such a study could bring ozonotherapy to the forefront for all-around infectious disease management, providing answers to our growing problem with resistant infection. Governments should take notice." End of quotation. According to the CDC, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, 2 billion people do not have access to improved sanitation. That is more than 35% of the world's population. Unsafe drink water, inaccessibility of water for hygiene, and the lack of access to sanitation together contribute to about 80% of deaths from diarrheal diseases. 801,000 children younger than 5 years of age perish from diarrhea each year, in the vast majority in developing countries. As explained by Velho ozone is possibly an even more potent drinking water disinfectant able to inactivate several human pathogens. According to an article published in the Journal of Natural Science, Biology, and Medicine, ozonotherapy has been utilized and heavily studied for more than a century. Its effects are proven, consistent, safe, and with minimal and preventable side effects. Medical ozone is used to disinfect and treat diseases like infected wounds, circulatory disorders, geriatric conditions, macular degeneration, viral diseases, rheumatism, arthritis, cancer, and SARS. Mechanism of action is by inactivation of bacteria, viruses, fungi, yeast, and protozoa. Stimulation of oxygen metabolism, activation of the immune system. The ozone could be used in all these fields without expensive investments. However, do we have reliable sources for the ozone benefits? Dr. Velho, Emeritus Professor at the Department of Physiology at the University of Siena, is one of the most important specialists on the planet about ozonotherapy. He is the author of about 480 publications and monographs, mostly published in international peer-reviewed journals, and 3 books on ozonotherapy. His last book, Ozone, a New Medical Drug, published in 2005, has an incredible number of 53 pages of references. On Google Scholar, there are nearly 130,000 results of scientific articles. And PubMed.gov, there are 3,588 results of scientific articles. Even on Amazon.com, there are 47 books. Are there other articles directly related to COVID-19? We find out 50 articles just in Google Scholar. There are at least 8 investigational drugs, including the most famous chloroquine, hydroxychloroquine, and ivermectin to combat the SARS-CoV-2. The general researcher's preoccupation is the side effects of these remedies. We need a drug safe, inexpensive, and efficient. If only one of these requirements is not met, we will not solve the problem. Now we need to answer these questions. What is the reason to not use ozone therapy? I don't know, but I have a clue on the preface of the first edition of the Dr. Botch's book, Ozone, a New Medical Drug. We can identify some aspects of the difficulties in introducing the ozone on traditional medicine. Quotation, actually, several scientists who surely received the book did not even bother to answer. Someone politely wrote me that, although the book presented some interesting aspects, it could not convince him because the ruling dogma in the USA is that ozone is toxic and should not be used in medicine. On the other hand, I received a few positive responses from clinicians who appreciated my effort in creating a rational scheme able to clarify how ozone acts and why toxicity could be avoided. Several practitioners confessed to be disinterested in the biochemical aspects because they hardly had the time to read the practical part. End of quotation. According to the Dr. Rowan and Dr. Robin, there are other barriers. Ozone's challenge is that it does not bring profit to justify private research to advance it towards regulatory agency approval, a process requiring tens of millions of dollars. Hence, few in the medical field are aware of it, and fewer will consider an approved therapy even to save lives. Am I defending the use of ozonotherapy? No, I am not a physician. I am a transhumanist philosopher. So why am I talking about ozonotherapy? What's my role here? If this treatment really works, we have a problem. This present problem can jeopardize the future proposed by transhumanists. If the techno-scientific developments are always limited by an economic spotlight or the lack of openness to the new, the project to build a superabundance society will fail. The transhumanist movement needs to put this debate in vogue. If we cannot disseminate a new safe, inexpensive, and efficient auxiliary treatment to help us to fight against this pandemic crisis, how can we believe that someday all people will have access to anti-aging treatment? If we cannot democratize ozonotherapy, we may have enormous difficulties to democratize other technologies if this doesn't produce huge profits. We cannot condition our rising, development, health, and well-being to profits. We will have a new road when the techno-scientific developments achieve the common people. If we could save at least one life using ozonotherapy, this already would be a marvelous thing. As FM 2030 taught us, even the loss of one human life, it is a colossal tragedy. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Keoma. We have one question for both of you. Do we have time, Jaime, for this question, or should we keep it to the end of the discussion?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't know I was coming back now, but it's fine. Yes, of course. Let's take a couple of.
And here we go. To both speakers, how do you think about the Academy actions to help people and the planet to be saved during this moment? Are we researchers just speaking alone? Anyone?
Well, I think that at the end of the day, there's always a tendency to accuse scholars of just talking or being armchair theorists. But we should not forget that theories, theoretical perspectives, and insight. They inform actions, they inform policies. And at this time, people, particularly, let's say in my own country, a lot of people are not just, of course, are interested in insights that can help. Yeah. What do we do at the moment? And how do we make sure we don't find ourselves in this kind of situation again? So I think that a lot of policymakers are out there listening, and they want to know what they can do to help the society, and they want to also know the kind of policy they can put in place. So, and it is important that they begin to understand that, like in Nigeria, having the way we are going here now, there's a need for convergence and combination of technology in a way that can help us manage this. Because at the rate we are testing and monitoring the system, it's going to take us 10, 20, 30 years to get all Nigerians tested alone and all that. So there's a need for them now to pay attention to any platform where people are brainstorming, exchanging ideas on what we can do to effectively contain and combat the pandemic. So I don't think it's just all about talking. It's also all about marshalling ideas that can help inform better policies.
I will maybe send a question to you both for this meta-global debate that we were saying is one of the threads, like, you know, threads of the forum. My question is, what could one gain from the actual plurality of realities that our Earth contains? In the sense that I believe that the idea of the globe as a kind of single entity, I think is very much of an illusion of colonialism, of European colonialism, therefore of humanism. And I think that some of the ways in which this is getting radically expanded through more kind of transhumanistic digital technologies, say Google's hypercolonialism of Google Maps, and the attempt to digitize everything, every atom in the planet, literally. So there's these streams of having a global single type of reality versus my preference, I think, the kind of discourse that many people from the critical posthumanist or metahumanistic domain would say is, no, there is no single planet. There's an endless plurality of realities in the biosphere and in the cultural spheres as well, and so forth. How can we, for instance, if we think of Bill Gates' claim in the famous TED talk of, you know, having better global health insurances everywhere, which is, it sounds very good, it would be wonderful, but it's also linked to a humanistic project of having a particular kind of health system as it is conceived in the West be applied everywhere, which is perhaps difficult, perhaps it's implicitly impossible due to the inequalities that are linked to colonialism itself. So it's on the one hand, if we want to call for, say, a universal health system that applies in the whole planet, which system do we go for? Aboriginal knowledges, you know, or do we go for just rationalistic Western medicine? And then how does that get applied? Why should that be instead of the other? Also, in terms of challenging the sources of a problem, there have been here questions about where the virus comes from or how. Okay, I also raise it connected to ecosystem disruption. Do we want to face that problem, and so forth? So, do we want to claim a universal solution, or do we want to learn from the pluralities in this meta-global world? Do we want to strengthen a belief in a single global globe, or do we want to go for more critical exchanges between all these realities to say, oh, let's not take for granted one single model, say, of what a health system is, for instance. I don't know, this is just a big provocation for discussion. We have no time, but still we should provoke.
Well, this question is so complex for me. So, Leo, can you answer this question?
Well, the thing is this. I mean, you know, when you say Western rationality, I don't know what you mean by Western rationality. Okay, there is this claim, you know, Western rationality. What does it mean? What does it mean? Why do you can say rationality from a Western perspective. Even when you say it, this issue came up when we had the last global Beyond Humanism conference. What does Western rationality mean? Whom are you speaking to? You know, and all that. And what does, you know, if you click on it, if you open it, what does it mean? And when you say it, does that mean that myself coming from Africa, I have a different kind of rationality? Okay? So for me, even what you are saying by say Western rationality, universality, all these things are open to be critically discussed. And for me, where I agree with you is that there's a need to look at this plurality. But what should be the driving force of the plurality? Are you talking about plurality for plurality's sake? Like today, I am telling you that, look, at the end of the day, we have a pandemic that is being managed, let's say, differently in some countries. Countries are closing in. America is closing in. They don't want every other thing. They want to manage it and contain it their own way. And at the end of the day, they're going to make that standard for other places, standard for other countries to go by. But what I'm saying is that it opens an opportunity for people to say, hey, we here in Nigeria, are there other ways we can also use to understand and combat this? For me, this could be plurality driven because people have seen the need, in quote, seen the rationale for it. It's not just plurality for plurality's sake.
Okay.
Thank you to all the speakers and to all the questions, but we will be having more questions and discussions thereafter. But I have to introduce the next speaker. So thank you to Leo Igwe and Keoma Ferreira.
Thank you.
Thank
Okay.
On screen now with me, I have brought Professor Sorgner. Just a short introduction for Jaime del Val and Stefan Lorenz Sorgner. Professor Sorgner is a philosophy professor at John Cabot University in Rome. He's the author of 5 monographs and editor-in-chief and founding editor of the Journal of Post-Human Studies, a double-blind peer-reviewed journal published by Penn State University Press since 2017. Furthermore, he gave talks, invited talks at the World Humanities Forum, Global Solutions Taipei Workshop, Biennale Arte Venezia, and TEDx, and is also a regular contact person of national and international journalists and media. On the other side, we have Jaime del Val, who is a metahumanist polymath who develops transdisciplinary projects across all arts, philosophy, technology, and activism, and has curated Metabody Forum events in over 30 countries. Jaime is neurodiverse and mestiza, microsexual and trans-species, is neither man nor woman nor human, and incidentally is not on Facebook. So thank you to both speakers, and the floor is yours.
Okay, how do we proceed? Let's improvise. Let me take just the last words of Leo, because I think that plurality is precisely a core, if not the core, concept that can be part of a metahumanistic agenda, and that defines, in fact, even the different views that we have around metahumanism. So maybe we can take this as a starting cue to, I don't know, do you wish to go ahead,
Please
Stefan?
go ahead. Please go ahead.
Oh, me? Okay, good. Oh, sorry. Okay, well, I mean, this plurality is even built. I will later claim actually plurality for the sake of plurality, and you will see why. Let me just start by saying that this plurality is built structurally in metahumanism, even at the level of our different views. So, of course, Stefan and I proposed the manifesto 10 years ago, have enormous resonances, and they are all built in there. But there are also some differences, and we claim them as a richness, as a structural plurality in the capacity. What we call radical pluralism in the manifesto means how one can hold contradictory views at the same time, and this is part of a richness of a field. The main, I would say, and Stefan will of course then correct me and give his own view, but I think the main digression we have is around the relation to transhumanism. I think for Stefan it's more in between post and transhumanism. I have a different take, so we will, I think, expand on this and dialogue around that. Many of you know that I'm very critical generally with transhumanism and its agenda, especially its more powerful agenda, which I mentioned before. So for me, I will now try to express why I think metahumanism is relevant today, what makes us different, in my view, from post or transhumanistic, from other kinds of existing agendas or discourses. I will try to be as short as possible. Let me just try to pick up some core ideas. So on the one hand, I think metahumanism takes critical posthumanism in the direction of a relational ontology of becoming that affirms indeterminacy, plurality, hybridity, movement, and the body against control, domination, reduction, impoverishment of experience. it's difficult to define because it works against the metaphysical tradition of being, this identity, this world made of things which are already defined. So it seeks recourse to what was the origin of philosophy, a philosophy of radical becoming, like Heraclitus, like all the pre-Socrats were trying to put up, and later since Nietzsche.
Connection problem.
We seem to be having
ways, I think it has strongly. Yes, sorry, my connection goes whenever I get a phone call because I'm using the mobile hotspot, so I need to watch out for that. I'm very sorry about this. Vicissitudes of our 4G world. So one could say that, like critical posthumanism builds upon more genealogical legacies of Nietzsche, metahumanism builds more upon his attempt to renew a philosophy of becoming, taking on also, partly and in a different way, Deleuze's and Guattari's legacy in this respect. For me, metahumanism opposes transhumanism's control-oriented and hyper-colonial agenda, although there might be, as I think Stefan might claim, other aspects in transhumanism, and affirms the non-dualism, non-anthropocentrism, non-phallococentrism of critical posthumanism. And now here comes the shift I see, and the shift I proposed in the manifesto related to many concepts I had been elaborating since around 2001 and which I kept evolving enormously afterwards. What I call the shift from performance to metaformance, which is, I think, a crucial one, from the content to the underlying frame. So I am very interested in questioning not just, say, the content of a particular medium, not just say what appears inside a perspectival screen like the one we are now looking at. So there's a lot of discussion, say, of media ethics, of what is the violence in an image, right? For me, it's important to shift to understanding the entire infrastructure of the medium. What is, then I ask, the ontological violence of the medium itself? So for instance, the medium we are using now, on the one hand, fixes us in a fixed point of vision in relation to a frame, which is a direct inheritance from the linear perspective of the Renaissance, which is, I think, the perceptual organization, the most reductive perceptual organization that has ever existed on the planet, that imposes the radical hierarchy of vision, immobility, and this works totally against how I think perception operates as always being cross-modal and transmodal, and of being changing alliances of the senses all the time, where proprioception is the major sense, I think. So, and always in motion. I also claim, from a radical and active cognitive approach, that how we move is how we think, feel, perceive, and so forth. So for me, the more aligned and narrow our movements, the more aligned and narrow our thoughts, affects, and worlds. So what I claim then is to bring back into experience a richer embodiment that has been impoverished over millennia of alignments with geometric environments. So since Greece and before, with the birth of Renaissance perspective, which is the crucial point, we live in a culture entirely biased by the fixed point of vision of linear perspective. It is that which grounded the Cartesian dualism. I think Descartes would have never been able to think the radical dualism of body and mind without there having been perspective 200 years before him, which had activated this kinetic organization of bodies fixed at a distance. So I want to shift them from the performative discursive critique of the content of our language and our frames to understanding how this way of framing reality and bodies at a distance is a particular historically contingent mode, which is extremely reductive. I insist it's the most reductive mode of perception, I think, that has ever existed on this planet, maybe on this universe. I claim instead a new theory of perception, which I am developing now more intensely, based on the sense of proprioception as a field-like sense distributed across all our tissues, which is also our direct inheritance from 4 billion years of viral and bacterial ancestors. So the body has a self-organizing capacity to think, what I call body intelligence. BI is where I see the source for a potential evolution and revolution, rather than AI as a control-obsessed, reduction-oriented tendency and mode of perception and of planetary scale organization. What is happening through perspectival interfaces connected with planetary scale networks of autonomous algorithms is that we become aggregates of what I call a hyper-cyborg, a planetary scale cyborg, the body, whose thrust is increasing reduction, increasing control, the thrust towards all-encompassing control. Now, I claim evolution as a process of increasing variation. That's because I claim fluctuation as the only ontological a priori of any universe. That's why I will briefly go, because we don't have so much time, to my brief text, which is, I wanted to present to you very briefly this idea of a multiversal declaration of meta-human rights. Oh my God, this sounds extremely more than humanistic, right? You will see it's not exactly that. So evolution is the movement of variation by which every universe is an expression and unfolding of quantum fluctuations. This law of fluctuation, as I am calling it, is the only a priori of any potential multiverse, as motor of any multiverse. It implies also, this law of fluctuation implies a right to non-reduction of movement and experience. So this law of fluctuation underlies evolution as movement of increasing variation. That's why I was saying I will claim plurality for the sake of plurality. I think that's the very ground of evolution within a universe. And that's why we have biodiversity, of which we are a tiny part and perhaps not the most interesting part, and not insofar as we might not be respecting that movement of variation. We need to bring it back. So reduction is meant in this sense, the right to non-reduction. I mean it as the right not to be reduced, not to have our qualitative richness reduced to pure quantity. This is the crucial difference I want to claim, right? The irreducibility of the qualitative and how we need to claim that irreducibility for sustainable and rich lives to continue. So I'm claiming against this millennia-long tendency to impoverish our embodied experience by aligning our bodies, by developing atrophy directly, literally, proprioceptive and kinesthetic atrophy, which is sold to us as progress. So in fact, what happens is that the further we want to reach, the more atrophy in the bodies, the more narrow our perspective gets. I want to counteract that tendency. So by proposing a multiversal right, in any multiverse, to non-reduction, the right not to have experience reduced to fixed points of vision and our movement reduced to traceable segments, right not to be subdued to reductive interfaces, to dualistic media and algorithmic opacity. This is a kind of negative freedom that goes along the positive freedom, the right to promote qualitative variation, behavioral indeterminacy, disalignments, evolution as variation, the right to promote proprioceptive richness and entanglement. This implies also, and I finish, the right of the planet to a planetary health, not to be disrupted, the right of the planet not to be disrupted, reduced, quantified, and exploited. This includes the rights of viruses, bacteria, and all formless lives. I speak of formless life rather than life forms, to sustain the movement of variation that is evolution. So I think I finish here because the time is short. And in any case, I for this genealogy, for the complex way in which many of the concepts in the manifesto have been present in many of my writings and have kept evolving in the theories I was just mentioning, which are more recent, you can check the website of metahumanism.net, where soon we will put up texts where we update our evolutions in relation to the manifesto. So let's have now our plurality exposed.
Yes, thank you, Jaime. Yes, I agree with you. If transhumanism is to be identified with a certain type of Silicon Valley transhumanism, then there is an enormous danger related to it. But this is not the only type of transhumanism there is. And we've already seen that in the presentation given by James Hughes earlier on. He himself also identified a specific type of transhumanism, whereby he mentioned the name of Peter Thiel, from which he distanced himself clearly. And this is sort of my way of showing, well, there's not one type of transhumanism. There is a certain stream which can be identified with a hyperhumanism, sort of that Silicon Valley type of transhumanism, which has extremely dangerous implications, paternalistic implications. On the other hand, there are many other thinkers like, Martin Rothblatt, James Hughes, who definitely represent a much more non-dualistic scheme, one which undermines identities, which stress the importance of becoming. And this is sort of I think the most important part, starting point from the manifesto. That's what drew Jaime and me together from the very beginning. Sort of when we met more than 25 years ago in London, sort of we had both a high recognition, evaluation of Heraclitus, of Nietzsche, and we realized the enormous impact of Platonic thinking and of sort of the Christianity, which is sort of the popular version of Platonism. Nietzsche calls it Platonism for the people. And that's all founded in some internal forms, in stability. And it rejects becoming. It identifies becoming with all kinds of evil. So even here, sort of the dualistic distinction between good and evil comes about. And many other types of discrimination are founded on that dualistic categories. So both from sexism, racism, discrimination, sexual discriminations, they're all founded in that very categorical dualistic framing, which is basically a heritage of that Platonic, Christian, Kantian way of thinking, which is so strongly embedded in our culture. And our culture is sort of particularly referred to the Western cultures, but the Western cultures had a enormous influence in all other parts of the world as well. And sort of the dualism which goes along with it is connected to totalitarianism. Is universality always means there's one standard, one criterion of goodness which applies to all. And if one criterion of goodness is supposed to apply to all, then that does violence against the plurality. And there is an enormous danger connected to it. And it's still there in most of the cultures all over the world. And that's something what sort of resonated most strongly in the thinking, sort of in Jaime's and my own way of thinking. Dualities bring about a lot of violence against the pluralities of flourishing, which we need to take into consideration. Instead, the thinking the realization that there's a permanent becoming of everything in all respects, it also undermines the loss of any kind of identity. And if one thinks sort of the initial response to these kind of reflections is, well, but there are loads of identities. When I look at the computer, when I look at the tables, when I look at certain insides, there's human dignity, there's human nature, then it seems to be clear, well, there are certain type of identities exist. But the interesting thing, upon closer examination, we realize all of these identities flow, they dissolve. We realize that these identities can no longer be justified and are often and are usually and they usually come along with strong forces against the plurality of flourishing. So it is the dangers which go along with these dualistic thinking due to the violence which is being done. And the interesting thing is that now, as we move into the pandemic crisis, the danger is getting even more problematic. In particular, because there's a certain war taking place, and it's a war about new created identities. So it's a war about digital data which takes place. And the interesting thing, it's currently mainly happening in between the United States and China, because they have so far developed the most efficient means concerning getting hold of the appropriate, they have got the infrastructure, they've developed the technologies in order to get hold of the relevant data. It's a fight about digital data which is occurring. And we've got so far different means of trying to get hold of the data, different political system. And here it's important to understand, by realizing sort of the Heraclitean flux, that everything's permanently in the process of change, permanently in the process of becoming. That also means all of these identities which created social systems, political systems, they are just contingent nodal points. They are human constructions. We have created them. They're usually created on the basis of human interests in order for them to become more powerful, in order for people to get richer. But if they're created, they can also be subject to change. And that applies to all of these insights. And so far, the powers which are being aspired for, which are most efficient, are the ones sort of in the libertarian US system on the one hand, and on the other hand, in sort of that state authoritarian system we have in China. So on the one hand, we've got the big companies who, in the US, we've got the big companies who manage to get hold of the data. Why? Because we give them to them. We give them to them for free. We work all the time, and we're doing the work right now. We're doing the work online, and they get hold of the data. And the data is to be identified with power. Knowledge is power. Information is power. And by having that information, the power increases. And by us doing the online work, and the digitalization has in the speed of digitalization, of the widely used of digitalization, has increased significantly as a consequence of the coronavirus pandemic, of this pandemic crisis. So here, on the one hand, we've got the libertarian version of collecting of becoming more powerful, which is dominant in the US. On the other hand, we've got this state-governed authoritarian way of collecting power. So it's basically a legal obligation for everyone in the political system to give away the data. So it's basically expropriation which takes place by the Chinese government. They basically collect all the power, they collect all the information from everyone. But in this way, they manage to even get more information probably than in the libertarian version in the US, because they can force everyone to get hold of all the great variety of information which is being given up. And the war concerning the digital data increases even further. And here a further step occurs, and the further step is a globalization. The internet is no longer a global entity. It's global, but some digital data only gets available on a local basis. And that's with the Chinese firewall which is occurring. So basically, the Chinese government gets hold of the information. Only the Chinese government has got the possibility of getting information and digital data from the people in China, as well as from the rest of the world from the rest of the world. Western companies do not have the right to get hold of the data from within China, only if they subscribe to the rules from China. So here we see that the internet is even no longer a global entity, because globalization movements take place. And that raises an enormous amount of questions and challenges, because the ones who collect the data become permanently more powerful. And that remains a challenge for the rest of the world. That remains a challenge for Europe. That remains a challenge for South America, for Africa, for Australia. Because the ones who have the power also have the money, financial flourishing. So, and now the question remains: how should we deal with that? And that is a very, I've got some reflections on that, but that is a very tricky issue upon which I think a lot of further reflections need to take place. And sort of the meaning of data collection is something which we all need to give further thought to, because this is something, this is a process which has only started, recently, because the internet has only been around, I mean, as a publicly available phenomenon since 1990. So it's only got a history of 30 years, and it's already changed the world we live in. And so loads of further thought, in particularly if one stresses the importance of plurality and becoming, needs to be given sort of what the meaning of digital data is and how we want to treat it. Thank you.
Yeah, let me just add onto it, and while we maybe start getting questions or not, that, yeah, I think within this idea of a radical pluralism, of working in many levels at the same time, that might seem contradictory, but might be necessary, because the world is full of contradictions and pluralities. So on the one hand, I would, and I do support, say, a research for, say, more democratic usages of data, and I couldn't agree more that we need to develop huge, even ontological research. I mean, I think we are ill-equipped to understand at all the reality of autonomous algorithms and big data. I tried to develop theories for that from my movement philosophy, because I think it's very hard to think that from the kind of disciplinary apparatuses and discursive apparatuses, say the Foucauldian approaches of biopolitical society. I think things have changed a lot. Like, for instance, think of Brian Masumi's concept of ontopower, of how algorithmic systems are constantly producing the new as a crucial mode of power. So the constant production of new patterns, the dynamic production of new patterns, is a crucial mode of power in big data systems, which are no longer representational but correlational. They are creating emergent patterns all the time, and how this feeds back in our experiences in the attempt to somehow preempt our future behavior, preempt our future desire, reorient our behavior in microscopic instants that operate under the level of conscious prehension. For instance, this is a crucial operational mode of how things are crucially working in our current algorithmic society. For this, we need to understand the actual movements that are going on there and how they are still grounded on perspectival interfaces, on tendencies to reduction, on reduction of movement to patterns, even to dynamic patterns. So the way in which big data systems always need to reduce movement to patterns, that is datafication. That is where I want to bring again my kind of approach in metahumanism, and in claiming also the irreducible side of movement. So yes, I support and go along with. So first of all, we need to understand better what's going on. I always say what we have in our pockets, say the apps inside a smartphone, are already far more advanced than any science fiction I have ever seen. But we don't understand this. We don't understand the complexity that is behind the opaque autonomous algorithm of the Uber app and the Google Maps app and the Facebook app and so forth. So that is a challenge. And then the challenge of how to, given that this process is going on, make it as open, democratic, plural as possible. So the datafication itself. But I think that is important, but it should never be the only program. I think it's equally important, and for me, perhaps even more important, to counteract the tendency to datafication as a universal tendency to reduction, with an equally important or even stronger tendency to non-reduction, as I was claiming previously. So to bring back into our embodied experience this lost richness, which is associated to the universal thrust, or say planetary dominant thrust, to datafication. So I think both approaches need to be strengthened and well related, maybe or not. Both have macro and micro political dimensions of all kinds. The latter one I propose especially also at an experiential level, but also at macro political ideas of ethics of algorithms and of media and so forth, but always with the aim not of maybe establishing yet another universal law that prohibits dualistic media, though of course it could be an outcome, a radical one, but more of promoting a plural culture that makes bodies more aware of reduction, because bodies recover more of the richness, of the lost richness in experience, the lost intelligence in body, and take it beyond. We have the evolutionary challenge of taking our body intelligence, what Nietzsche maybe was calling the great reason of the body, and the greater health, this capacity to sustain plural forces at the same time, and pluralities of forces at the same time, and modes of non-linear thinking. This is what I think also needs to be strongly, and this is, I think, where metahumanism brings in a very specific twist that you maybe find less in other scenarios, where you find attempts to think the commons in data as commons or democratic usages. But I think all of them, and this is also structural to metahumanism, need to be there, even if they look contradictory. We need that plurality of approaches in our plural and contradictory world. Sorry, I'm very long.
Yeah, no, the critical side is something which is still central and becomes even more important in all the various cultures around the world, when it comes just for criticizing the encrusted structures which are still there as relicts of our former cultural heritage. So we still have enormous kind of totalitarian and paternalistic implications, which we inherited from our former cultural ideals. So it's still sort of the Renaissance ideal, which is being upheld, as well as sort of that speciesist distinction between humans and animals. So only humans are regarded as having the special status in the world, and the rest of the world is categorically different from us as human beings, even though many of us have already sort of realized the implausibility that it's still valid in cultural relicts, it's still valid in the legal structures. So that's one of the elements, I think, which we will need for a long period of time. Secondly, as a consequence of the further developments with the implications of, in particular, digitalization, actually there's a risk of new dualities come about, and the risk of further discriminations occurring because of, well, with social media usage. It's still, we all live in our bubbles. We all live with the people with whom we share our own self-understandings, and thereby sort of the tensions between the groups get increased further. And together with the tensions, there's, things like racism, speciesism, sexism, or also heteronormativity get promoted further. And that's an enormous danger. So we need to be aware, but maybe being aware of it is not even sufficient, because that's how social media networks works, and they absolutely also need to be undermined in order to decrease the violence which is currently occurring in various parts of the world. And how to do so will be a further challenge, which I think with sort of meta-humanist reflections can be extremely also helpful and important for making people aware of it, and for finding new alternative ways of dealing with it.
Since you mentioned social networks, let me comment on this idea of posthumans going viral, what implications that has for me. When Stefan proposed this name and I said, okay, let's go for it. And I thought a lot about it. We even did another cycle here in Madrid on what I proposed as viral philosophy, or antiviral as well. Now, what many different meanings could this have? I've been already claiming today several times that viruses are a mutation force in evolution, and I claim that force, and we are their offspring largely, right? At the same time, we have viral media, and I already mentioned how I see algorithmic culture as intrinsically reductive in its tendency, and some people claim that as necessary. I say, well, maybe not necessary. Maybe it's an option, or it should be an option rather than an obligation. So viral media, I think, are part of this Renaissance culture of fixed points where bodies are aligned to one another in specular, homogeneous way. This is part of what I call the pan-choreographic. Right? So it's a way of organizing movement, perception, and bodies in a homogeneous manner, so that gestures propagate across each other in a homogeneous way. Now, of course, in social media, this is complicated by the fact that it's autonomous algorithms in planetary scale computation networks, which are really managing the backstage, the unknowable, opaque backstage of these perspectival interfaces that block us and make us into immobile, disembodied kind of beings. So on the one hand, there's then for me an interesting contradiction in saying, well, going viral, I'm not in Facebook. I hate social media for this reductive kind of quality of, this way of fixing oneself as a body and trying to kind of erase it. But then what other sense can there be to going viral besides, say, the obvious connotation of the virus, of the coronavirus, of maybe getting the virus or something like that, which was not implied, I think. For me, it's a question of claiming back the mutation power of viruses in evolution and having a philosophy that can counteract the reductive force of viral media. The homogenizing force of viral media needs to be counteracted with a mutation force like that viruses have been enacting on Earth for 4 billion years or so. So how, then that's the question, how do we do that? How do we bring back a possibility to think? For me, it's all related again to movement, again, the meta-humanistic twist. Meta, let's remind the way we use meta. Meta is interesting as a prefix because it means in between, so the relational aspect, it means going beyond, but then also transformation, mutation, incipiency. It means also like multiple levels, like transversality, like meta language, like things always relating to one another in different ways. So I think we play with all these resonances. I do that all the time in all my concepts, meta body and so forth. So then movement is always relational, it's always incipient, it's always going beyond itself as a becoming, right? It's always creating fields that relate to one another. So then it's about understanding these fields of movement and understanding which of them are more reductive, which of them are imposing themselves more, which of them are instead allowing more of a co-emergence of movement. This is not easy to summarize, and it's taken me many years of book elaborations to develop a perception theory that accounts for that as well. We are totally biased by perspective, by Cartesian fixed points of vision. Unfortunately, all our epistemologies and ontologies have been grounded upside down on this most reductive of all modes of perception. So that's why I'm trying to put up a different account of perception as proprioception, as distributed sense. What I want to finalize by saying is that thinking in new ways means moving in new ways. This would be a meta-humanistic shift. Yeah. We can't just discuss things in the typical kinesthetic way of, because that particular way of not moving or moving just algorithmically will be also a particular way of thinking. If we really want to transcend this and feel this entanglement, not just ideologically, but moving with the world in our proprioception, in how we feel our muscular tensions are the way we feel the world as well, then we can enact other ways of thinking, which are the other ways of moving, which are not linear anymore. The body is itself a field with endless potentials of variation, which are modes of thinking. Anyway, this is a longer thing that relates to my proposal for a radical movement philosophy, a theory of proprioception, and the Algorithmicene as an age of algorithms that has narrowed down that field in many problematic ways. So thinking new ways, moving in new ways. That's my motto in a way, in richer ways, not just in new ways, in richer, more plastic ways. And if we don't...
I think this is sort of the most important thing to keep in mind, I guess, what I'm trying to remind myself of, whenever someone comes up, this is necessary. This is how it's always been, and this is what we must do. It's important to keep the moving element in mind, to remembering yourself and that there are different options. Then one should even try to force oneself to think about different options, how it was in the past, what could be a different approach for dealing with it, because what we take for granted nowadays, it's just a contingent nodal point. It's something which is in the interest of a certain group of people, which is necessarily going to change in the future, and it was different in the past. So it's of permanent becoming, which I think that's the most radical paradigm shift with respect of our Western humanist past, and I think one of the most difficult ways to, one of the most difficult challenges with which we are confronted with, because it's a challenge. What remains, or what would be an alternative for the future? Which nodal points would be more appropriate? Which are the ones which we should go for? But I guess, yeah, we should come to open up the discussion further.
Yes, let's bring Chrissy, all the others in, and we move on.
Yes.
While they come, well, let me just invite the audience to consider how different this format is to a usual conference, and because precisely of the embodied, think of it, and why, what do we lose in this format? What embodied? Oh, sorry, you want to introduce the people, Chrissy? Maybe.
No, I mean, now we actually have a 5-minute pause in our schedule.
Oh yes, but we are so late.
Yeah, we can open up the discussion.
We need a pause, but
I will bring.
We don't want people to go for. I mean, in Spain, it's very dangerous to say 5 minutes because people would take 5 hours almost. But do we make a little pause, or we try to continue because we're half an hour late? But you're absolutely right. We need a pause.
I'm bringing in the other speakers.
Let's bring in the other speakers, and
here we are.
Yeah, let's try to maybe do a quicker kind of final discussion if we can. Now let's just say that we have more speakers in the background, but the studio, which allows 10 speakers in the background altogether, only allows 6 people to be visible. So we will be swapping and having people coming and going. Maybe I can go to the background so that other speakers of today can come in, and then we swap later, maybe.
And here we do. We also welcome all questions to come in. Let's see if we have some older questions that we can just bring. Oh. Question. Oh yes, we had a question previously from Fabrizio Conti, back from our first speakers, and he wanted a question to all the speakers. What do you think can be replied to those who point out we haven't really seen any robots replacing doctors and doing the dirty job and dying in the hospitals? In other words, he says, how far are still the outcomes and innovations predicted by transhumanism? And maybe we can open this up to discussion and move it on to further topics. Here we go. Professor Sorgner, if you'd like to possibly lead this.
Replacing doctors in doing the dirty job and dying in the hospital. Well, so far, the robots can't die. That's the first thing which comes to my mind. However, actually, I've seen in some Chinese hospitals, I've seen robots moving around and carrying stuff in various rooms. So there is this development currently taking place. And so even, I mean, I remember there was this seminal study in 2013 concerning robots taking over, digitalization, who will get affected and how will people get affected? Will more people get unemployed? And during that study, it was said that the jobs of doctors cannot be digitized and cannot be automated. But in the meantime, actually, it's become clear that this is a wrong judgment. That's an implausible judgment. Because if you want to detect a malignant tumor, it used to be the case that sort of the sensitivity was not good enough for AI to detect it just a couple of years ago. In the meantime, the reliability of AI to detect the cancer is better than in a real is better for a specified AI than it is for an expert doctor in the field. So so it's not the case. It's just a it's a process. It's a continuous development, and I mean the process of digitalization, automation. of gene technologies. These are all very, very recent events, just from a global perspective. I mean, as I mentioned before, sort of the internet has only been around for 30 years, the public usage of the internet. And from a global perspective, this is hardly anything. And it's already affecting all aspects of our life world. So this is why we need to seriously consider and think about the implications and of how we want the world to be like, because it is guaranteed that it will have even more drastic and radical impacts in the future. So in particular with digitalization. And I don't think we've really grasped what an enormous shift is taking place as a consequence. And so, but it's in the end, it's up to us to structure the future and to decide what we want. So that's why all of these discussions are needed.
I'm here to introduce Yunus Tunsal, who also has some announcements that he'd like to make and add to the discussion. So please take them.
Yeah, hi. Thanks. Hi, everybody. Greetings from New York. Thanks to the speakers. Just a comment, maybe a question, but Stefan already dealt with it. When we use terms like totalitarianism, autocratism, we have to be very careful because they're also very micro, close to macro totalitarianism. In the United States, Afro-Americans are all living in hell, most of them. I mean, that's, and we are supposed to be the biggest democracy here. I mean, come on, it's life, it's hell. I mean, it's been happening, you've been following in the news. So we have to be very careful. Liberal democracies are also corrupt, bankrupt. That's what I want to say. Of course, this is not in any defense of totalitarian regimes. It is just that we have lots of problems in the so-called democracies. But you did, Stefan, mention micro-level aggressions and totalitarianisms. Thanks for that. But Francesca called me. She also got cut off. She apologized for being cut off. She lives in a small place, and she also had some announcements about the post-humanism group in China, Latin America, upcoming events, all on the website. I have the website here, the posthuman.org. If you go to the news, there is also a post-humanism formation happening for Turkey, which is a new development. They invited me, being a Turkish American. They somehow found me, so I will also connect them, these young scholars, to our bigger post-humanism group. And also our event next year, hopefully in Lesbos. I mean, I guess everybody knows that already. So thank you very much.
Yes, maybe just a brief comment to what you said. And when I talk about totalitarian and paternalistic structures, I don't just refer to political structures. And actually, it's part of any rigid dualistic framing of the world. Whenever you say, so this is good and unconditionally good, then we've already got that dualistic framing, and that has implications exactly concerning any types of these problematic discrimination, from racism, sexism, speciesism, and as well as heteronormativity. It's all got to do with the same kind of, I'm not saying that these are the same types of discriminations and they have the same relevance, but I'm saying they're all based on the same cultural phenomena. There's something which is unconditionally good, and so all the rest what doesn't subscribe to that ideal is regarded as evil. And that's part of a certain way of thinking which has a particular Western Platonic heritage, which is highly dangerous and violent, and that occurs on a political level, on a macro level, as well as on a micro level, on all different strata of our social life world. They occur, and they have very violent and dangerous implications.
Sorry, may I interrupt to introduce Anna Markopoulou, because she's actually like a kind of special guest in this final discussion, right? And I think we were kind of I don't know, maybe if Chrissy, do you want to do her introduction?
Sorry to have cut you off there. Yes, Anna Markopoulou has a PhD in Sciences of Education at the University of Sorbonne, Paris Saint-René Descartes, and she will actually be guiding this discussion. So sorry to have cut you off there, Jaime. Thank you.
Thank you, Christy Soteriadis, for this kind presentation. I would like to share with you some reflections that have arisen about the current dilemma posed by coronavirus and its implicit pandemic. The dilemma between privacy and freedom, as well as its political and philosophical implications. We should perhaps think that this dilemma, as well as its solution, is problematic insofar as the concepts that make it up and make sense of it, such as privacy and freedom, are now being re-evaluated in a special way, arose due the pandemic and what is, the state of emergency. As we already know, in the case of the state of emergency, the state suspends the force of law under a right of self-preservation. In this light, the following questions arise. What is the role of public and private interest, public safety and order, but also individual freedom, which has been suspended in the name of saving the planet from disease? Often, the solution to this dilemma is to sacrifice privacy for the sake of freedom. In other words, to give so far private data, medical and other, of our lives to the state to ensure our health, public safety, and therefore our freedom. But is that how we give our private and health rights to the full control of the state? Does this therefore lead us in the long run to a bare life in the sense of our complete enslavement to the state and the consequent proletarianization of our lives? We must also ask whether the dilemma between privacy and freedom is nothing more than an ideological cover-up that obscures the anthropocentric character of the supremacy of human bias and causes violent repression and marginalization of Zoe to make it a bare life. Finally, should we reconsider freedom in the light of critical posthumanism? What freedom are we talking about? But above all, what is the subject of this freedom? Is this, in fact, this will for an abstract freedom, an ideology that legitimizes the transformation of politics into biopolitics? In this light, I think we must reevaluate the concepts of privacy and freedom each time in the context of different and conflicting interests and expediencies set by the social groups that make up a society. In the light of critical posthumanism, we would say that the dominance of an anthropocentric discourse in the formation of the historical subject led to an excessive rationalization of the state. This rationalization was largely the result of anthropocentric philosophy of the Enlightenment, which in turn led to the proletarianization of the spirit and the biopolitics of their life. In the context of a critical posthumanism, then, we must reconsider our judgment of the collection of private data, not in the light of the dilemma between privacy and freedom, but in the light of the algorithm. The algorithm, however, is not a neutral ideological concept, but is part of a social and economic context, that of modern capitalism and of neoliberal societies. the more computational the algorithm, the more favorable the entropy will be, negentropy, as Bernard Stiegler would say, of modern society. Thank you for your kind attention. Any questions? Continue the discussion or reflection?
Yes, well, I think that we had in our previous pre-discussions that there was this issue coming up of, can they be, and I think Stefan has his view and others had, so can they be separated? And some people say, yes, we can separate privacy and freedom. Others think it's more problematic. I think it can be a rich and deep discussion. Maybe we can devote some time to it. There are also some questions that we can go to, but if someone wants to react to this issue of, can they be separated and then how? I mean, for me, for example, I've never been defending privacy as such, but rather the capacity for having emergent environments where they are not prescribed by pre-existing laws, by pre-existing rules, and so forth. So it's not a question, because privacy for me is a problematic concept because it comes from, I think, largely, or it's influenced by kind of disciplinary society culture of enclosures. So you need the private room for sex, for being a body. The body needs the enclosure. And I say, no, I defend public sex. I defend. But then, of course, we have the other extreme, like big data is not public, it's not commons, it's another type of opacity as well. So in current digital culture, we have another type of enclosure, which is very different from the disciplinary enclosure of a physical room. We have another type of opacity that doesn't allow us to intervene in the process. So what I claim then as kind of more privacy, so to speak, is how can we have spaces which are emergent, which are not rules and so forth. And that's where, for me, it's intrinsically linked to freedom, not in the sense of, strictly speaking, something that owns only to you. So then having data per se being subjected to all sorts of intrinsically opaque algorithmic profiling, for me, does violate principles of freedom, because these processes will not be neutral. If there are algorithms tracing our behavior for doing profiles, which we cannot know how they are happening, what and how these algorithms operate, because there is an intrinsic capacity to algorithmic profiling, besides, say, the intention of the corporation. It's built in the technology. It's ontologically opaque. Then, for me, there is a deep problem that we still need to understand by understanding what the reality of algorithms is, right? That's my thinking of that.
I guess I would frame the response a little bit differently. I think the Chinese social credit score system represents the current extreme version of what a society without privacy, with algorithmic governance of citizen behavior, total surveillance actually will lead to. And the Chinese are, fifth of the world's population, so they're attempting to implement this. That we have to fight that. That has to be opposed. But the COVID has shown that it's extremely important that we give up certain kinds of our privacy and certain kinds of our freedoms for the public good. And the extreme of the United States, where 40% of the population is saying, I'm not going to wear a mask, I'm not going to socially distance. If you introduce social distancing apps, I'm not going to use them. And all of this is a conspiracy by Bill Gates to put chips in people's bodies and to advance the transhumanist elite conspiracy, blah, blah, blah. That's the other extreme. And so I think what we need is to have a vision of what it means to give up necessary forms of privacy and individual rights for the public good, but in a democratic and accountable context. And I think the experiments that with social distancing apps, for instance, in Europe, I think Germany is trying to roll out a social distancing app that anonymizes, so you can't tell that someone's been with their mistress, but you can tell that you've been around somebody who has had COVID in the last, and where the hot spots are and things like that. I think that those are the kinds of intermediary steps that we have to recognize as necessary and inevitable where we're giving up parts of our privacy. Again, back to the Black Lives Matter minute. We are giving up the privacy of people not being filmed all the time. And there's some really bad things that come out of that. And, you know, people being exposed as for their private sexual behavior being exposed when they didn't want it to be. There are really good things coming out of that. Racist murders are coming out of that being exposed. So I think the loss of privacy is really not the right way to frame all this. It's about whether we have democratic, accountable societies that can take away the bad kinds of privacy and protect the good kinds of privacy.
I totally agree. Just to make a clarification with my approach, what I think one of the major challenges is that this opacity in algorithmic processes, which I was mentioning, that makes it that I think that the way many of the apps in our pockets are working makes them very close to the Chinese model. So, for instance, the way in which Facebook promotes a kind of social scoring system as well, implicitly, and the way, say, your bank is going to look at your Facebook profile to see whether they give you a mortgage, or the way in which the people giving you a job will also research your data, the way in which your bank, the kind of insurance system will try to get data of your health and I think it's not so centralized as in the Chinese system, but I think we are already inhabiting a sort of social credit scoring system. There's one part in which our, say, Western model is even worse than the Chinese, is that it's become the desirable condition for everyone. Everyone wants to be in Facebook, overexposing oneself and quantifying the life of others, so then people buy the likes. You know, this kind of model of, you know, overexposure, where in fact we never know the actual profile that is being made of us by these algorithms, which are the real deal. We are the product that algorithms create for third parties that will send us the publicity. So the real profile that people do in Facebook is not, I mean, the profile people do in Facebook for themselves is not the real profile. The real profile is the one that autonomous, opaque algorithms perform in the background by Facebook or other companies like Cambridge Analytica. Remember the famous scandal of Cambridge Analytica. I think that represents the core functioning of the internet. I speak of it as
Jaime,
yeah.
The problem I have with that kind of narrative, and I think the surveillance capitalism narrative that is also being promoted by Susanna Zuboff is similar. And it basically argues, I think, an over-deterministic understanding of the people's relationship to these algorithms. I agree with you that in a corporate dominated society, the way we have in the United States, and where the corporations are able to buy your health data, they're able to buy your polling data, they're able to put together millions of pieces of data about you and know you better than you can know yourself. This is a problem of social control. But I think that, especially with Generation Z and millennials, you see a self-awareness and understanding of how these processes take place. I've been very amused that just in the way that I interact with YouTube and with Spotify, I have to train the algorithm. I have to train the artificial intelligence to give me the kind of music or videos or information that I want. I think younger people today understand that they're in a relationship with these larger corporate political structures, and they have a sense of agency about how they can deal with that, how they can manipulate Facebook to get it to do what they want to do. And I think to simply say that this is all an equally totalitarian situation as the Chinese social credit system is a misunderstanding and a denigration of the actual human agency that people will have.
No, I wouldn't say that it is exactly the same, but I think that certain very problematic aspects need to be. I think that this idea that hyper-control is a desirable condition, which I think is promoted by the kind of Facebook culture, which is also a culture of immobility in a way. For me, it's highly problematic. I think it's a very fascist model of sociality, right? And the fact that it's made desirable by people rather than just imposed by a state, to me, makes it. So we have the fascist model in the West and the totalitarian model in the East, as you know, Deleuze-Guattari would distinguish between these both kinds of approaches. And well, you know, but yeah, of course, I agree with you that we need to make nuances about many, many things in there. Although, to me, the question of agency is highly problematic when the opacity and complexity of algorithms is rising exponentially in such a degree that it's way beyond any imagination and any science fiction movie that I've ever seen. But I agree with the nuances, yeah.
I mean, we all see that there's a lot of power and financial gain connected to that information. And the challenge is sort of who's getting the power, who's gaining from that. And in the Facebook model, we've got the CEO, the owners of the big companies having the financial gain from us working for them by being online, by being on the social networks. On the other hand, it's sort of the political leaders in the authoritarian Chinese system who are benefiting from that. So the digital data, which is connected to so much power, it's never in none of these two cases. It's not in the interest of the people. It's not in the interest of the demos, and that's what I feel as highly problematic. And but there are a lot of helpful information which can be associated with this with the digital data, but they shouldn't be primarily in the interest of the company owners or the political rulers, but they should be such that we all can benefit from them. And that's why sort of a democratic usage of the data is needed. But in order to establish that, that's really tricky, and that's really and full of challenges, because of there is a danger. Sort of privacy. It's difficult to separate privacy and freedom. And because privacy goes along with information about someone, and the information can be used against someone else. So the person who have access to it, they can limit the freedom of someone else. In that way, they can sanction other people. That's sort of the sanction theory of privacy. And in a different way, it's a different theory associated to privacy. That's the expropriation theory. So privacy, it's my digital data, it's my property, and whoever takes it away from me. So if the digital data was used in my interest, I mean the interest of the demos, of the people, then it wouldn't be expropriation. If the digital data was used wouldn't have the implication of illegitimately sanctioning people, then it wouldn't undermine freedom either. But that's very difficult to realize. It's because whoever has the information, there's such a strong human tendency of abusing it. So that's why I think in principle it can be separate, privacy and freedom, but actually to make it work is a really difficult challenge.
One of the challenges that we were mentioning in previous conversations that Stefan and I were having on this is, like, for instance, think of the economic challenge. I mean, one model is the corporate system of Silicon Valley, so to speak, and the other is the Chinese corporate system, which is partly capitalistic also. It's very complicated. But in any case, the infrastructures at stake are enormous. Like, of course, the European Union doesn't have. I mean, if we would think, say, of having the European Union develop these infrastructures with a kind of public management of data, what kind of economic system would one have to invent, which is neither the libertarian capitalists nor the state capitalists, totalitarian Chinese? I mean, it's a whole enormous challenge. Besides, of course, the actual infrastructural challenge, how do you really create such an infrastructure that is not centralized and that allows commons, the data as commons? Mm-hmm. In the whole process.
Exactly, yeah.
And besides that, there will be also anyway this greater and to me almost insolvable challenge, which I was mentioning, of the ontological opacity of algorithms, that places a whole new level of political dimension and challenge, which we yet need to think about, I think. So yeah, just to outline some of the many complex implications of such a problem.
Right? One example of the complexities, Andrew Yang in the United States has proposed that people should get paid for their data exhaust. That basically, if companies are going to use your data for algorithmic advertising purposes, you should get a portion of the profits from that. I think that's a fascinating proposal, exactly the right kind of thing we should be thinking about. It would also mean that people who would not otherwise participate in this kind of algorithmic surveillance would be incentivized to do so, and incentivized to have their behavior be guided because we had capitalized it. So I think it's a very complex terrain to try to figure out what the trade-offs would be to maintain what I think are the tangible benefits of having these kinds of algorithms and data in our society, but also to protect privacy and reduce social control.
He also proposed universal income, right? Andrew Young, yeah.
I fear sort of that individual model of getting paid doesn't work, because individually the data is not relevant enough. The data only becomes relevant if you have big data. You've got data from loads of people. And sort of in a libertarian system, basically, well, most of the people, many people just don't care. We all do, whoever places a smartphone next to the bed doesn't care that it's easy to survey you, that it's easy to listen to whatever happens in your room by putting a certain app on your phone. And that's why sort of there's not enough incentive for the companies to pay you. Firstly, because you're just one, and we need big data. And secondly, most people don't care about it. So that's why I think a more structural reform is probably the only pragmatic option which we can take.
I would say we always need like several different options at the same time. I think it's interesting as a claim, like at least to make people aware of what's going on, even just, and if people realize, oh yeah, I should be getting paid. I mean, that would be already as quite a revolution. I mean, considering the kind of awareness that exists nowadays. But this, I think, connects interestingly to another condition of digital culture, which is what I call hyperwork. This idea that more and more any activity of our lives gets capitalized, but mostly, well, sometimes you get actual money for it, like say Airbnb, your bed there, or sometimes it gets capitalized without getting money, like Facebook, like your affective life and relations gets capitalized by the company. You become the product in a more opaque way. So I think this needs to be problematized in as many ways as possible, to made visible in as many ways as possible, and to claim that is all work. It's all capitalization. Yeah. What do we do with it? That would be, first of all, the big question. Okay, there might be a plurality of ways. The one that Stefan proposes, getting paid for it, and then what I propose as well, to not just reduce our lives to clicking on screens, and to datification. I think that's also important.
Yeah.
Maybe some of others of our team want to enter, so I can be put out if you want. Well, anyway, it's 9 o'clock. We could take a few. Let's maybe look. Sorry, at the audience, that we haven't paid attention to your questions. Maybe we can take a look at that, and then maybe some final announcements. And there was a question by Devika Saha, which I looked at before, because she was referring to my invitation to think about the difference between this encounter and a physical conference, which is the field, which is the trip to the conference, which is meeting people, having drinks, and looking. I mean, here we can't even look at each other's eyes when we talk. I mean, everything. For me, it's not. Devika says human touch is absent. I say yes, but for me, everything in nonverbal and embodied communication is missing, which is also the crucial part for me of verbal communication. So, for me, let's say the core aspect of communication is missing as a kind of differential embodied process where I am affected by others. So I am mutating my thought by relating to others in this complex field of movements and relations and sensations and thoughts that are changing all the time. I feel extremely trapped in this kind of course, it's a great opportunity if given the absence of other possibilities. But for me, it does make a dramatic impact. And I would add to Devika, not just touch. For me, the whole spectrum of communication is becoming hugely narrowed. And well, we have to work around that. And I mean, I take now the opportunity to make my announcement to remind you that tomorrow, well, there's the performance to end with, which will be one way to also invite you to disalign in the camera. But also then the workshop that I will propose, which is in the line of the many ones I am offering for many years, and now during the pandemic, it's also a means to invite people to discover how they can reinvent their bodies as an infinite field of kinesthetic, proprioceptive, and multisensory richness, just through tiny variations in how you feel your own movement. This is what I call BI. I invite you to discover your body intelligence. So this is, you can write to the email that you find in the program, and I will send you the specific Jitsi link in a different platform to join the collective workshop.
I would suggest we give every speaker another 1 minute for sharing some specific insights, information which they want to share in order to close off the day.
Are there no more questions here in the chat? No?
Because time-wise, we've already progressed quite far.
Yeah. I was just wondering if we have no more questions in the chat. Ruben was asking a question, I think. Well, okay. Here, Ruben making an analogy with the basic duality of political systems, equality versus freedom, where when one of them increases, the other decreases, defining in themselves the main political systems, and it continues. We could then think of seeking a balance between privacy, freedom, and basic rules to comply with as a tool to achieve a just society. Well, I think we were providing kind of answers through multiplicities of different necessary complementary responses, or someone wants to address this more specifically.
I think that find a balance between privacy and freedom. It means that we will find a balance between society and state, because in my view, the great problem now is the relation between society and state.
And the state, sorry.
The state.
Governments.
Government, yes.
Okay.
Society and government, state in this. So, if we want to find the balance, before we have to have a balance between state and society. This is my answer.
The old rejoinder to libertarians used to be that what they wanted was the freedom for the poor to sleep under a bridge. And I think the idea of the trade-offs of freedom are under-theorized. So Stefan was giving a good intro to some of that. But in the current context, the idea of freedom in the United States is the freedom to end up dying on a respirator. So I think a lot of but at the same time, the Trump administration has been pushing for restrictions on the rights of protesters. They've been pushing for greater surveillance of society for political reasons, not just for COVID. So obviously we have to fight for a political sphere of rights and to push back against this corporate domination. But I don't think that all struggles for freedom and individual rights have to be lumped together. And I would just point out that given the narrative that I started with, that the polling data shows that concerns about data privacy and being doxxed, they're pan class, so they're across society, but it's basically educated people who worry about that kind of thing. Poor people worry about automation, the effects on the bottom line, more than they worry about privacy and these kinds of civil libertarian issues. That's not to say that they're not legitimate issues, and we are, and if our class of the professional managerial class are the ones who are trying to defend society from rapacious capitalist data corporations, then fine. But I think there are more things to worry about than just the data privacy issues and the fact that YouTube may show you a video that you wouldn't otherwise have seen on the basis of algorithms.
So should we give each speaker the chance of a final comment?
Yes, please.
Okay. All right. I think I would like to respond to the question earlier about robots replacing doctors doing dirty jobs, and how far with the outcomes and innovations of transhumanism, how far have we gone with that? And the discussion on data. Like I said, I speak from an African Nigerian perspective, and I always ask myself how relevant and how applicable are all these issues to us. So, and from there, I try to bring as much insight as I can into maybe what I could call a global debate. I think here robots are not going to replace. Robots are not deployed. Robots do not deploy themselves. They're deployed by people. So the issue of bringing robots medical into the hospitals is something that has to be debated, for instance, in the parliament or things like that. And sometimes there are ideological issues. So I'm speaking from the Nigerian issue, because here, when it comes to issues about transhumanism, about some of these discussions about post-humanism, a lot of people are still caught up in some kind of conservative, ideological, or religious warp that hamper debates and discussion when it comes to these issues. So I think that we have to ask ourselves, for instance, we're talking about storing data out there. Who stores the data? Yeah. Who accesses the data? And who uses the data? So I think that there is an angle to it. Well, I don't know how to describe it. It's a political angle to it, whereby some people use the data for what? So it is important we understand. For instance, okay, Nigerians, the data of Nigerians are stored by maybe some people. For what? What do they use it for? And Nigerians are aware that their data, some people have their data and what they're using it for. So I think that it is important we also, first of all, like I said, understand that at the end of the day, the issue of maybe the outcomes of transhumanism, the ideals in terms of maybe curing death or abolishing mortality or death, or making people not to die, or technologically enhancing human capacities. These are topics and issues that are sometimes made in a lot of ideological and religious debates that do not hamper the kind of techno-progressivism that James Hughes is talking about. Because a lot of people see this as a threat, to them. So we have to also ask ourselves, how do we situate, these techno-progressive debates within a context where some people are so tied to the religious dogma and the religious authoritarianism that hampers them from actually, appreciating, this kind of prospects and optimism about the future and about the use of technology in enhancing the society and enhancing human capacities.
Thank you. Keoma, Yunus, James, do you want to?
Yeah, I just want to, Leo, I just want to thank for his comment about religious dictatorships. The Middle East has the same problem as in Africa. But about the discussion on privacy before, I just want to say two things. I know, Stefan, you also discussed it in your Übermensch book. But I want to bring another angle. That's basically, we need to look at our freedoms, whether they are positive or negative. This is by Jean-Paul Sartre's discussion. And the other thing is the effects that we create. That will be Nietzsche Deleuze dimension. So really two important things, I think, that should be brought into discussion on privacy and the social life. My freedoms, to what extent my freedoms bring positive or negative impact on others. I mean, I go out to a bar, whatever, and I spread the virus, or I protect myself. I still have some fun, but also I am responsible. I'm sensitive to the needs and freedoms of other people. So that's the kind of dividing line between positive and negative freedoms that Jean-Paul Sartre discusses. But Deleuze and Jaime also works on this topic, the kinds of effects that we create, the affectivity. So that's what I will just add to that discussion about privacy.
Thank you. Keoma?
Hi, I would like to thank you so much, Professor Sorgner, to invite me to this fantastic forum. And I would like to say that transhumanism is not the most dangerous idea of the road, as Francis Fukuyama told, but it depends only on how we can deal to these questions. Thanks.
Exactly. Thank you. Okay, James? Or Evie?
Yes, I just like to add two very short comments. One, we must think if privacy and freedom are two different things sometimes, are two quite different things. And the one that does nothing makes one contradictory to the other. And the second comment is that I very much agree with James Hughes' last comment on the new generation and their relation to data. I believe that the new generation can perfectly deal with any platform collecting data, and can even find and invent if they have to, even electronic guerrilla methods to surpass the objects of technology when dealing with prevention of data control. So it could probably be a fear limited to people of, let's say, our generation, and not followed by all the newer, let's say, generations. After Generation X, I mean, where I belong. Thanks for the great comments and discussion here, the great talks. And well,
do we have maybe James? No, or
Sure.
Anna?
Yes.
I just want to say I'm so delighted to have the opportunity to join with this discussion, because I have not been able to make it to the previous Beyond Humanism events, and I know that there's very important discussions and work being done in these circles. And I also have to apologize to Stefan for not supporting the Journal of Post-Human Studies the way that I should. But the last 4 years have been very distracting because of the rise of fascism, and I thought that it was my responsibility to do some work in that area. But I think the moment calls for us all to give deep thought to the future of humanity in ways that most people in politics are not. So I think the political relevance of these kinds of discussions is equal to the fight against fascism, and perhaps is a part of the fight against fascism at this point. So thank you again.
Thank you. Anna, do
I
you want
want
to?
Thank you all.
Oh, yeah, James, do join us next year, hopefully, on Lesbos. Lesbos is an amazingly beautiful island. Historically, it's the birthplace of biology, so that's
you all have to join us.
You all have to join, exactly.
It doesn't look like Americans are going to be allowed out of America in the future, which if I was you, I would also adopt that policy, so we'll see.
It really makes a difference, and there we always try to include sort of sufficient time in the afternoon to go for a swim together, to have a Greek coffee, and in the evening to have some ouzo and some delicious Greek food. So that really does make a difference.
Shall I mention here that there's a beach, not the best one, but there is a beach under the University Hill, below the University Hill. So it's you can reach it within 5 minutes in the intervals between sessions. It's a challenge.
Can I add that I think what makes it so special, I think it's the most post-human university I've ever seen, because it's full of dogs that live there and are taken care of by people. they enter the classrooms and the conferences, and they are part of the family of the whole university. And
Yes,
I think that it's really the most unique university I've ever taken part in.
They're present everywhere. They're here now. Okay. Oh, no, the barks were not from my office. However, I saw a comment on the barking. It did not come from here.
It's also the birthplace of Sappho, one of the oldest post-humanists.
Exactly.
An early post-humanist, Sappho.
The petrified forest can be found there. There is also a Turkish hammam, which is really fascinating, and one of the main bird watching sites in Europe. You can see. I've seen black pelicans. I've seen black storks, pelicans,
yes.
and many other birds and tortoises, which Aristotle used for vivisection purposes in order to invent biology.
And of course, Sappho's village, Scala Eressos, has the most beautiful beach. It's a nudist beach, and it has the wonderful queer lesbian community there, which is lovely. And I love go dancing there and staying a few days. So you should all know.
You definitely will. You will definitely need some extra days to go around the island, and you better see it as vacation, as a vacation period, before and after the conference.
Exactly.
Good. I think we could say maybe goodbye for the day, and we hope that you'll join us tomorrow in this other time zone where we are more starting with Australia.
Shall I make a very short comment
Yes.
on the book presentation we missed? Because it is not yet a compiled volume, but I have to mention that with Jan Stasienko, we are for years attempting to compile a reader of post-human studies. Well, there are many objects, there are still many objects to this. What we originally thought of is to have a complete, to one extent, and pluralistic reader for anyone interested in post, trans, and metahumanism, especially students of philosophy, of social sciences, arts and humanities. But this is not a simple task. It has been a very difficult task so far. We're doing our best to complete it. If we're optimistic enough, we're expecting it. Schwabe is the publisher. By, I don't know, November 2020. At least I hope we may have it at the conference the next year. Just a short comment on this book.
Hopefully my book will also be out next year, so we will have many books. Okay,
Right.
so tomorrow is different time zone, remember, so we start at 11:45 Central European time, right? It's earlier.
Exactly.
So we hope to see you there. And then, in any case, whoever can't participate, of course, the video will stay for at least 1 billion years or so in the YouTube channels and servers. So you can also come back there and visit it.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right.
See you all tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.
Ciao. Ciao. Thank you. Bye-bye.